Andy, a Canadian government spokesman said that your art could not be described as original sculpture. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Why do you agree?
Well, because it's not original.
You have just then copied a common item.
Yes.
Well, why have you bothered to do that? Why not create something new?
Because it's easier to do.
Well, isn't this sort of a joke, then, that you're playing on the public?
No. It gives me something to do.
He was the most American of artists, and the most artistic of Americans. So American, in fact, that he is virtually invisible to us. We look at him, and knowing little of ourselves, learn little of Warhol, because he was us, in all our innocence, ambition, and insecurity. A hard-working Democrat, a churchgoer and businessman, a social climber, empire builder, and inveterate consumer. In Warhol, the simplicity of a typical American citizen and the simplicity of artistic genius are so intermingled that we cannot distinguish them, nor properly credit either his Americanness or his genius. Dave Hickey.
I think he's a touchstone of the culture, and I mean more than painting and art history. I think he's a touchstone of the culture we live in, a touchstone for the entire culture of the post-war period. I think he is probably the most important artist of the second half of the 20th century, maybe the most important artist of the 20th century. If we needed to find a visual form to just distill what it's like to have been alive in the last 50 years, the image would come somewhere from the corpus of Andy Warhol.
There is no way that anybody who is much younger than I am can understand how profoundly different the world before Andy and after Andy looked. You know, a supermarket before Andy looked one way, a supermarket after Andy looked another way. He literally changed the world, you know, and you change the world by changing what people look at, the priorities that they place on it. And so he changed the world, and the cultural consequences of that are really profound.
He wanted it so much to be successful. He didn't want to be second-rate or an underling in any way. And he didn't want to be first class or top rank either. He wanted to be a superstar. He wanted to do a big nova that would eclipse everything. That's all he could settle for if he was going to have any happiness in life. And it did happen. But the impact overall was what was important. And he would be willing to live an ordinary life as a person if he could have the experience of doing this impact on the culture. And it's not showing everybody that I'm important type stuff. It's like Zeus throwing a lightning bolt. It's the being able to throw the lightning bolt. Not being Zeus, but being someone who has the power to throw lightning. That was the only thing that would satisfy Andy, and it happened.
I think the reason why he has such staying power, and there isn't a proper understanding of him because he was so complex, yet he said he was so simple. But see, that was another dodge to really, because he's probably one of the most complex people I ever met.
I think his greatest gift was immediacy. Making you see in an unmediated way, just right there in front of you with kind of absolute frontal clarity. I think that he had that, he had a feeling for it, and a grasp of it that was unique. In addition to that, curiously enough, despite the sort of a phasic, I never had an idea, I'm just Andy Warhol, that sort of numbed out look and claim, I would say that Andy was one of the very impressive artists of ideas. His art always suggests something about life that can be formulated in philosophic terms. And I think he knew that. I think that just as he got the force of personality by withdrawing into his shyness and his personality, So he got the force of ideas by withdrawing from any active assertion of ideas and letting them happen through the medium of his art, through the medium of that immediacy.
So tell us about the film. What's the film about?
It's called Blonde on a Bum Trip.
Are there any marbles?
What's it about?
Here's one.
It's about a naive young lady who goes to Hollywood to make it big.
One narrative would be the Marjorie Morningstar narrative. I think that Marjorie Morningstar was one of his early self-images. He must have signed certain works. Andy Morningstar.
Who shoots me up with,
it's basically a girl from nowhere moving to somewhere. The star narrative, A Star is Born. I think that's the big narrative of Andy's life.
From the very start, he was not who most people thought he was, or what most people thought an artist should be. Born on the eve of the Great Depression, a child of enormous transformation and change, at once strangely afflicted and strangely blessed, he would come of age as America itself finished coming of age in the decades following the Second World War, as one of the greatest transformations in the history of modern culture took the world by storm.
He was a ethnic Polish with a bad nose and St. Vitus dance and blotches, etc., who was gay and really, really swish and had a freaky mother and was bad with people, was probably dyslexic, a little autistic, maybe had Asperger's syndrome or whatever one of those things is. Yeah, and it would be really nice to become Lana Turner, and art let him do that.
It's hard to go from further down to farther up in contemporary culture. I think the thing about Andy, and a lot of people in America who rise to the top and become very famous, is that Andy had no idea of bourgeois life. He never saw it, he never lived it, but that's, I think, what he imagined. You know, I mean, that was the goal, was like normal life. Never anything normal about Andy from the first to the last. You know, he's in the ghetto, he's hanging out with Liza. He's taking nude pictures of drag queens. You know, he's being shot by Valerie.
Well, there's the fact that he was this poor boy from an immigrant family, from a very deprived immigrant family. His father had died when he was young, working against every disadvantage, who was carried to very considerable success on the strength of his talent alone. That's in itself very interesting. We say it should happen a lot. It doesn't always happen, but it happened to him.
Warhol once said, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes.
By the 60s, he'd become one of the most influential artists of his day, described by some as a genius for his work in pop
everything
art
from a
culture.
charlatan to a visionary. He was America's high priest of pop.
I mean, Andy understood that democracy and commercial culture were inextricable, I think. I mean, Andy's primary transgression was his primary gift, is that he was okay with commerce. And by just saying, yeah, it's there, it's what I do, you know, the world changed the world.
In 3 astonishing years, at the dawn of the 1960s, Andy Warhol would turn the art world upside down and take American culture by storm. Radically revising the meaning of art and our sense of what a painting could be, he would take the idea of art in the age of mechanical reproduction to its logical extreme, permanently breaching the wall dividing fine art and commerce. Grasping as no one before or since the function of fame in a mass society, he would force us to confront and re-envision the world we live in, permanently transforming the way we see the world around us. Along the way, he would transform himself, rising from the humblest of backgrounds to become the most famous and famously controversial artist of his generation, at once fulfilling the promise of the American dream, and at the same time redefining it, reinventing it, and calling it into question.
There's no way to really plumb Andy's instinctive selfishness. In other words, Andy did nothing but try to make the world safe for Andy. But in order to do that, he had to exercise such a profound cultural paradigm shift that, there's no end. I know there's no end of the people that I know who were empowered and given permission and socialized, on the occasion of Warhol's production, he issued this sort of nationwide permission that really freed America from World War II, in my mind. It really marks the beginning of the post-war period. Andy's idea that we all should be on TV, that we all should be famous for 15 minutes. All of this is just outrageous. You know what I mean? It is anti-elitist in the extreme. But it's also, a new world. The pop world was a new world. All of a sudden you could see the idea that America could come together, you know what I mean? That there was that promise there, that vision of some kind of synthesis. It's straight people and queer people and rich people and poor people and movie people and literary people, and it was all coming together.
I think that Warhol's desire to film everything, or to tape everything, or to redact or reduce everything to some kind of artistic embodiment was a form of transubstantiation. I think his philosophy of art and of life was to take a possibly unbearable and chaotic reality and pass it through the looking glass of some medium, and ideally subject those raw data to as little manipulation as possible. Maybe not even be there behind the camera, or not even use one's hand, to essentially silkscreen reality and make it new. And I think all of his search for different media, TV, movies, books, paintings, sculpture, performance, was an attempt to play again and again this trick of transubstantiating garbage and making it valuable.
It is a fascinating fact that Andy was one of the visual artists, one of the great visual artists of his period, who dreamt of going to Hollywood. At one point, he thought of renaming the factory Hollywood. At the same time, he was an artist with, among his many talents, could not be found any talent for narrative. He couldn't tell a story, didn't know anything about telling a story. So here is an artist with zero talent for narrative, whose life, nonetheless, is like a novel. It's completely coherent. His story was one of the things that was most compelling about him, what people got and understood about him right away. Even though his genius was for immediacy and for absolute refusal to tell a story. Just, this is it, nothing more, nothing before, nothing after, not where we're going, not where we've been, just right now. But at the same time, what happened to the man was a novel. And everything about it had a kind of strange and powerful coherence. I think that he was an artist dealing with immediacy, intensity, vividness, power of connection, and the threat to all that comes with death. And that was a powerful narrative force in his life. He lived it whether he wanted to or not. I think the reason is that Andy was really attuned to some very large issues, despite his famous superficiality. And one of the things is that immediacy, especially in the great traditions of the Romantic movement, is always on the edge of death somewhere. Because we're always losing the moment. It's always vanishing. It's like Faust says to the great moment given to him, linger yet a while, thou art so fair. Right? And yet it's gone. And that going, endless going, was something that Andy was really a genius about.
I try to think of what time is, and all I can think is, time was. Andy Warhol.
And his background, like everything else about him, was so odd and so vague. I mean, he came from nowhere, insofar as there is nowhere in Europe. The people were incredibly poor, and they had this faith. I think, again, the faith kept them going. I mean, they had no money. They left the area as soon as they possibly could because there was so little work and so much poverty.
His parents were from a part of Central Europe called Ruthenia, which is on the borders of what is now the Ukraine, Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. When they came to the United States, they lived in the Slavic ghettos, but as one of Andy's brothers said to me, we didn't really know what we were. We knew we weren't Polacks, we weren't Honkies, which is their word for Hungarians. We spoke this language called Slavish, they'd call it.
Basically, Andy grew up in something that looked like and felt like and acted like a Central European ghetto, completely surrounded by America. You know, I mean, that is, if you've been in that neighborhood in Pittsburgh and you've been in Czechoslovakia, you know, physically, that's the same place. And if everybody's talking Slovak and everybody is living in village ways, and then you're totally surrounded by all of this iconography and everything, you've got to both see the connections and see the differences. And I think that Warhol understood the power of that. He had that sort of romance with America, but just the giant distances, you know.
He was born Andrew Warhol on the 6th of August in the summer of 1928, in the tiny low-ceilinged bedroom of his parents' house in Pittsburgh, the third and youngest son of Andrei and Julia Warhol, hardworking immigrants from the heartland of Central Europe. One of his first childhood homes, in a working-class slum strung along the polluted waters of the Monongahela, was the worst place I've ever been in my life, he later said. 2 drab rooms on the second floor of a narrow brick row house, so cramped for space that he and his brothers Paul and John had to sleep together in a single bed.
And I remember 3 houses like that before my dad bought his house on Dawson Street. First thing, Andy was 6 years old, and he asked me, is there a yard? Because we didn't have no yard where we lived before. We lived like in 2 rooms with an outside toilet. Then he says, is there a bathtub in that house? I said, yeah, we got a whole bathroom in there. Yeah. He was real happy about it. I gave my dad a lot of credit coming over here, didn't know the language, and he saved up enough of money that he bought that house cash, $3,200, I still remember.
All through the Depression, his mother Julia, a strong-willed, idiosyncratic, deeply loving woman with a knack for drawing and a beautiful singing voice, helped bring in money any way she could, cleaning houses for $1 a day and making floral bouquets from tin cans and crepe paper, which she sold door to door for $0.25 apiece.
I still remember her when we were small. We didn't have no radio or TV to keep you quiet, and in the winter, she'd tell us to come in the kitchen and she'd say, all right, somebody draw a picture of a cow, you know, and then the one that draws the best picture will get a prize. So what she did, she bought the Hershey bars for a nickel, real big, you know. Andy would always win, you know. She says Andy had the best picture, you know. She had a lot of influence on Andy, you know. She started him out when he was small, and I guess it just took off on him. He stuck to his art since he was like about 5 or 6 years old.
Every Saturday night and Sunday morning, Andy and his mother made the 3-mile walk to St. John Chrysostom, a small Byzantine Catholic church filled with incense and lit by candles, where they sat through the long services conducted entirely in Old Slavonic, which always began with an exorcism of the devil.
Andy, as a little boy, was taken by his mother to Vespers, a Saturday night ceremony service, and then 3 masses on Sunday morning back to back. And they have this iconostasis, which is a grid, these screens that cover the altar and are only opened up during the communion service. So he was 8 hours a week looking at this iconostasis, a little child, you know, taking it all in. And what he was seeing was a grid of portraits of the saints, very 2-dimensional, with gold leaf backgrounds, and perhaps 9 on either side, maybe 18 altogether. I mean, which is so much like his work, you know, especially his portraits. They've got this simplicity and this sense of color and this iconic quality that comes right from that sort of Byzantine, Eastern Rite kind of art.
I noticed where he was different when we picked up sides to play, softball, and he was out in the field. We'd play like about 5 or 6 innings, and then hear somebody hit the ball out where Andy was supposed to be. And Andy wasn't there. He was sitting in front of, on the steps in front of the house, and he was drawing pictures of like flowers and butterflies. And that's where I noticed he was different,
From the very start, it was clear to both Andre and Julia that there was something different about their youngest child. Pale-skinned and frail-looking, bright-witted but high-strung, and prone to accidents and ailments of every kind, he refused to take part in rough-and-tumble games. From an early age, clearly preferred the company of girls, and was so excruciatingly shy that he was often unable to enter a room where his own family had gathered, curling his hand around the doorway instead to show off pictures he was particularly proud of. Not long after his 8th birthday, he contracted the illness that would permanently alter the course of his childhood, when an episode of rheumatic fever developed into a severe case of St. Vitus dance, a disorder of the central nervous system characterized by extreme and often frightening mood swings, and by uncontrollable spasms of the arms and legs. School, challenging from the start, now became a nightmare for him. The disease made it difficult to tie his own shoes or to talk without slurring his speech. When he tried to write on the blackboard, his hands shook so violently that his classmates erupted in gales of laughter, sending him back to his seat in tears. He eventually had to withdraw from school entirely and be confined to bed for months.
I always had a theory about Andy and his work, and I don't know where it came from. He got this wonderful idea that there was something remarkable about staring at something for a long time, which is probably what somebody does who's awfully lonely in his life. He always said that he had 13 nervous breakdowns before he was 13 years old. And I would think that one of the things that happens to somebody like that is to try to keep yourself sane. You stare at an object, you somehow concentrate. And I've often thought that you can look at something like that and bring qualities to it that, because it's such a common object, you sort of don't even think about.
The prolonged illness permanently scarred him, inside and out, leaving him with a mysterious albino-like loss of pigmentation in his skin. Large reddish-brown splotches all over his face, arms, hands, and chest, an almost crippling anxiety about his physical appearance, and a lifelong hypersensitivity to touch. Determined to coax him back to health, Julia transformed the Warhol dining room into a 24-hour sick room, where for months he convalesced, whiling away the long days, filling in coloring books, cutting out paper dolls, making collages out of pictures cut from movie magazines, and listening to the new family radio.
He was this lost little boy in this house where nobody spoke English. He was sickly, he was effeminate, the other kids made fun of him. And he would write away in the fan magazines for autographed photographs of the movie stars. And he would read these fan magazines. He just somehow absorbed this mass culture, like right at its root, where it really started, the Hollywood promotion machine of the 1920s and 1930s, That's where it really began.
Awkward and painfully vulnerable on the outside, he became the absolute master of his own inner world, capable of intense and almost obsessive feats of focus and concentration, spending hours at a time poring over his artwork and his collection of cherished images. He developed a particular obsession with Shirley Temple, wrote away to her fan club, and received in return a glossy photograph signed personally by the child star, which he venerated with an intensity that rivaled his mother's passion for the icons of her church. By his side much of the time was Julia herself, warmly urging him on, triumphantly rewarding each finished picture with a bar of chocolate, all the while chattering away in a musical mixture of Rusine and broken English.
They were very close. They were children together. When he was sick and stayed home from school, she was nearby, And he recognized absolutely that she was a central figure in his life.
It's a secret workshop, what went on in Julia Warhol's kitchen. I don't know if I have the answer, except that maybe his answer is turn to the least likely source to get your art lessons. You know, imagine that Warhol learned more about how to be an artist from Shirley Temple and Lana Turner and Julia Warhola than he learned from Duchamp, Jackson Pollock, Picasso. You know, his art has the maternal inscription in it.
Eager to nurture her youngest son's artistic gifts, Julia enrolled him at the age of 9 in a series of free art classes given by the Carnegie Museum of Art. Every Saturday morning, he would make his way across the steep ravine that separated the working-class world of Dawson Street from the spacious precincts of Shenley Park, sometimes spending hours at a time after class was over, wandering through the galleries, carefully studying each painting and sculpture. It was his first exposure to the world of fine art and to a life beyond the narrow confines of Dawson Street.
Andy was short of his 14th birthday when my father died. He was on a job in West Virginia, and they were moving some heavy equipment, and there was a spring that was in the summer, and all the men drank the spring water, and here it was contaminated. They didn't know it. They all got sick, and he's the only one that didn't pull through.
For 3 days, his father's body was laid out in the living room of the tiny house on Dawson Street. Terrified of seeing his father's corpse, Andy hid upstairs under a bed, weeping uncontrollably and refusing to come out. He just didn't want to see Dad, his older brother Paul remembered.
My dad, 5 days before he passed away, he told me he was going to go to the hospital. He says that I just want you to make sure that you pay the taxes so you don't lose the house, and keep that $1,500 for Andy's tuition for school. He says he's going to go to a college someday. You'll be proud of him.
2 years later, the family was dealt another crushing blow when Julia was diagnosed with cancer of the colon and had to have an emergency operation to remove her large intestines. Did Mama die? Was all Andy could say to his older brother John after the surgery was over.
She was in a hospital for about 6 weeks, and Andy would come from school. I'd make a sandwich, and I'd just open up a can of tomato soup. So I must have probably made it just about every day, you know, soup and a sandwich for about 6 weeks when my mother was in a hospital.
In the end, Andrei Warhol's confidence in his youngest son's gifts would not prove unfounded. All through high school, he remained a lonely, undistinguished student, still hampered by dyslexia, odd-looking and shy, and utterly uninterested in dating girls, a disinclination Julia stubbornly refused ever to acknowledge or come to terms with. But he astonished his teachers with the dedication he brought to his courses in drawing, and by his senior year had become an assured draftsman with a special gift for portraiture. A more talented person than Andy Warhol I never knew, one teacher remembered. He was magnificently talented. Shortly after his 17th birthday, on August 6, 1945, the day the first atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, he enrolled as an art student at Carnegie Tech, his way partly paid by the postal bonds his father had set aside for him. The baby in a class of returning veterans, many 4 and 5 years his senior, he was remembered by one teacher as a small, thin boy who had a great talent for avoiding personal contact. Threatened with expulsion after failing to pass a daunting first-year course called Thought and Expression, he worked furiously to redeem himself over the summer, speed-sketching street scenes in the increasingly fluent style he had begun to make his own. The remarkable drawings helped convince the faculty to reinstate him, and that fall brought him the Institute's coveted Leiser Prize, which carried with it a $40 award, the first money he ever received for a work of art.
It was very apparent to all of us that Andy was extraordinarily talented. There was this marvelous quality. Andy was a very young person. He liked to laugh. He was very naive and left himself open in a way. He was like an angel in the sky at the beginning of his college times. But only for then. That's what college gets rid of. Philip Pearlstein.
Still painfully self-conscious about his looks, and especially about his prominent acne-blemished nose, which had prompted his brothers to give him the nickname Andy the Red-Nosed Warhola. He confided mainly in women, never spoke about his sexual interests. Like most of his peers, was not yet sexually active, but was quietly assumed by most friends to be homosexual.
I think Andy had this indefinable quality of the holy fool, utterly unlike any other human being. I'm not saying he was in touch with God or anything, but he just was different. As I say, very passive. Things happened to him. He was a witness rather than a participator in life. And this, in a curious way, protected him. I always felt that there was some kind of divine protection of Andy. I mean, he was delicate, fragile, vulnerable in lots of different ways. But there was this sort of curious iron faith that kept him going.
I think Carnegie Tech, in some ways, both sharpened Warhol's skills, but also gave him something to push against. I mean, he really didn't follow the course at all. He wasn't a follower, mostly because he had a very different idea of what he wanted to do. The other thing that he discovered, which was a really radical invention for him, was the use of what's called a blotted line technique. What it is, of course, is to take ink and to make a drawing on one paper and take another piece of paper and blot it on top. It's really a monoprint, essentially. And in finding that technique, Warhol found a key to something. First of all, he could make many images from one drawing, the fundamental basis of his career. But he also created something that looked printed. And that's very different than just the original line. This became a technique that he experimented with throughout his career. And the other thing is, I think by going to Carnegie, he realized that there was a world beyond Pittsburgh and that he had to go to New York.
As graduation approached in the spring of 1949, his thoughts turned increasingly to New York. His mother did everything she could to dissuade him from going, warning he would end up dead in the gutter, without a penny in his pocket. But in the end, nothing could dissuade him.
So he told my mother, he says, you know, I'm going to have to go to New York. He says, that's a place where they have a lot of magazine companies, and he had the right idea, you know. So I remember I took him down a train station, I give him $50. He had some money saved up.
In the second week of June 1949, he said goodbye to his mother and brothers and boarded the overnight train for New York with his friend Philip Pearlstein. The next morning, just after dawn, he emerged into the vast echoing Valhalla of Pennsylvania Station and stepped out onto 7th Avenue. He had $200 in his pocket and a portfolio of drawings under his arm. He was 20 years old. Behind him lay Pittsburgh, before him the vast, sprawling city of his dreams. For the next 4 decades, it would be the only place he ever really felt at home.
You have to remember that in the art world, the strength up until the Second World War, and for 100 years, the strength was in France. And the schism that absolutely broke it was the Second World War. We kind of dominated the world after the Second World War, and first-generation painting, abstract expressionism, spearheaded by Pollock, occurred. And it was absolutely the dominant style. Andy very well knew that. Everybody knew that.
I think that he wanted the same thing that many major artists and many minor artists and many failed artists have wanted. He wanted to be very famous. It was very important to him. Being famous being very successful at what he did was a mode of survival. I think that Andy would have seriously considered the possibility that life without it is not worth living. And he was ready to go all the way to do it. He was really driven in that way. It had to work. It had to work. And I don't think he spent an hour of his life without thinking of how to make it work.
I'm not certain he knew what he wanted to do. He was young, he had a talent, he had to make a living. I think that he always had admired what fine artists were. He certainly knew, the difference between what a commercial artist was and a fine artist was. When he arrived in '49, it's of course the moment that Jackson Pollock is being portrayed in Life magazine as the famous Jack the Dripper. And it's quite interesting in that sense that there's almost a notion of a kind of, I don't want to say superstar, but, certainly that was not an insignificant thing, and I'm sure it impressed Warhol in that way. He suddenly saw that maybe an artist could be as famous as a movie star. But like Perlstein, he came up in a generation that didn't believe you could make a living off of being a fine artist, so you had to do something else. And of course, the very first job he gets is to work for Glamour magazine, where he's hired by Tina Fredericks, who was the art director, illustrating shoes for an article prophetically called Success is a Job in New York.
Few people ever rose more swiftly in the cutthroat world of commercial art than 20-year-old Andy Warhol from Pittsburgh. In the third week of June, 1949, he moved into his first apartment in Manhattan, a grimy, roach-infested sixth-floor walk-up on the Lower East Side, the first of many he would share with friends over the next 2 years. The next morning, he made his way to the headquarters of Condé Nast Publications on Madison Avenue, where he presented his portfolio to the art director of Glamour magazine, Tina Fredericks.
I greeted a boy with a big beige blotch on his cheek, possibly going up to the forehead. He was all one color, weird. There seemed something other-earthly or offbeat, different for sure, elfish, from another world. He had a breathy way of talking. His voice was slight, unemphatic, whispery, covered over with a smile.
Struck by the quality of her visitor's drawings, Fredericks gave him a sample of shoes to draw as a test assignment. 2 months later, his first published drawings ran in the September 1949 issue of Glamour magazine. When the typesetter omitted the final A in his name, he made no effort to correct it, and for the rest of his life called himself simply Andy Warhol. He was on his way. The extraordinary apprenticeship he would serve over the next 10 years would lay the groundwork for everything that came later.
Throughout the 50s, he's earning his living as a commercial illustrator, and he becomes increasingly successful. Although he's successful almost from the beginning. He's working for art directors, magazines, record companies, producing a whole variety of art really made for reproduction. And he becomes very famous for a kind of line that he didn't necessarily invent, but certainly becomes his signature line. It's called the blotted line. And this was the technique he perfected. It led to a sort of simplified kind of drawing. And that was part of the essence of the Warhol illustrational style. And it had almost a kind of naive effect, so that it had a kind of air of having not been done with great skill, but almost awkwardly.
This line is something that a lot of the art directors are attracted to, principally because they said it had a printed feel to it. When something's printed, it implies that it's wanted by more than one person. It's in print. And, to this day, we still live in a culture where we want things in print. It becomes the famous 15 minutes of fame, if you will. He had to deal with art directors who constantly needed to perfect an image, who had to get an image that would communicate to not just one person or 10 people, but tens and hundreds of thousands of people. So he saw something, perhaps more than his other illustrator contemporaries did, about what makes an image communicate. Throughout his career, Warhol understands scale, he understands texture, understands movement of the eye. He understands how to make a composition, but he also understands something that I think makes him probably one of the most extraordinary figures since Matisse, and that's how to use color. His sense of color is just unbelievable. And then on an aesthetic level, I think Warhol had a great capacity for finding permutations within the same. A great capacity, which is evident throughout the 50s, and of course is the hallmark of his later work, to find a single image, a single theme, if you will, and to endlessly change it. To mine a territory that was very narrow to some extent, and then push it as far as you could, was something that printmaking made absolutely possible. To find the difference, to really find the difference. What happens if you make it red, if you make it yellow, if you make it pink, if you make it blue? The capacity of his mind seems without boundary in that kind of way.
Throughout the 1950s, Warhol's aesthetic activity was primarily in drawing, and that technically remains at the core of his aesthetic gifts. He was a brilliant draftsman, utterly brilliant and highly developed draftsman, and became better and better at it. We think over the course of the 50s, we haven't cataloged or counted them yet, but there must be thousands of drawings. And I don't even know how to say at this point whether when we say thousands of drawings we mean his commercial work or the work that he didn't do for commercial purposes, or how we begin to distinguish those purposes or not.
There's always a parallel in Warhol. He's got the work that he makes for really a public realm, if you will, which is in advertising, and then in the private realm he's doing books, principally promotional books that he sent out to his clients, all the people that he worked for in the ad industry. In the Bottom of My Garden, various books where he's actually already beginning to mimic what is the basics of silkscreen design.
I think that the work he did as a fine artist in the 50s when he was also doing commercial work is some of his most arresting stuff. It's the nudes. He did a lot of freehand drawings from live models, and they're really amazing.
If you look at the boy drawings, for instance, they're all about touch. There's this contour line that almost seems never broken, as if he never lifted his eyes from the subject and his hand kept moving constantly over the contours of the young man's body. Touch becomes almost alive, animated in the drawings through not just the hand, not just the fingers. This is not some insipid notion of touch. This is a touch that totally electrifies the entire body.
By 1951, he had begun to make enough money to move into an apartment on his own, a tiny basement flat on East 75th Street. He had also cemented a reputation not only for the freshness and quality of his work, but for his odd personal style, his unfashionably thick glasses, battered sports coats, and caved-in shoes, and for his oddly endearing habit of presenting his work not in crisp portfolios, but in brown paper bags. Up and down Madison Avenue, art directors took to calling him Raggedy Andy and Andy Paper Bag.
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy probably was a genius. I know that he had just an incredible tactical sense of what went. You know, I mean, he liked to make it beautiful, and he knew he could. I mean, he's a professional illustrator. And he can make it beautiful, and he can make it look good, and make it edgy, and he could do it every time. And he liked doing it every time, and he could do it without even doing very much. You know, he could come in afterward and do that made it okay. From whence drives the confidence and the arrogance and the enthusiasm. I mean, you know, he felt like he could do it all day long, every day. I felt if he wasn't doing it, he was wasting time. He liked to do it. It terrified people. You know, I mean, he was a genius.
And yet from the start, the success that came so easily in his work would prove painfully elusive in his private life. He was over 25 in 1953 when he had his first tentative sexual encounter, with a picture clerk he had met at the New York Public Library named Carl Willers. Though the attraction was mutual, Warhol's paralyzing anxiety about his physical appearance doomed the affair from the start. He was acutely self-conscious, Willers remembered. He thought he was totally unattractive, too short, too pudgy, grotesque. A conviction so crippling, he could barely bring himself to risk the intimacy sex required, and according to Willers, almost never did, preferring the role of the observer to that of the participant. Desperate to transform himself, while still in his 20s, he had his nose reconstructed and his skin surgically sanded, without much success. There was even less he could do about his greatest source of distress, his rapidly thinning hair. He had already purchased a realistic light brown wig, when for reasons he would never quite explain, he chose to replace it with a dubious-looking gray one. The first of hundreds he would come to possess in the years to come, ranging from light silver to blinding white.
Inside, he was a very beautiful person. That's what I really liked about him. But he had an enormous inferiority complex. He told me he was from another planet. He said he didn't know how he got here. And he wanted so much to be beautiful. But he wore that terrible wig, which didn't fit and only looked awful. Charles Lisenby.
Even stronger than his craving to transform himself physically was the obsession that had haunted him since childhood, his hunger for fame and dream of becoming a star. Not long after moving to New York, his obsession found a new object to attach itself to.
In 1948, Truman Capote's first novel was published. It was called Other Voices, Other Rooms, and the photograph of Capote on the dust jacket became utterly notorious. Warhol was so taken with this photograph that he began to write fan letters to him. And then when he moved to New York, he began to telephone him, write more, and essentially stalk him.
He wanted everything that Truman Capote had. Blonde looks, ubiquity, fame, verbal powers, precocity. Truman Capote was the literary Shirley Temple, really the child star. And so Andy sort of wanted to be Truman Capote.
In fact, there are stories of him trying to actually be mistaken for Capote, believing that somehow he looked like Capote or could begin to look like Capote.
I remember the stories about him and Truman. He hung around Truman's front door, so to speak, and wrote little notes to him. Happy Wednesday, happy Thursday, happy Friday. I think Truman was sort of put off by this after a while.
Capote, for his part, simply ignored the mounting pile of mail from his obsessed admirer, whom he dismissed, he later said, as one of those hopeless people you know nothing's ever going to happen to. Just a hopeless, born loser. As far as I knew, he added, he was a window decorator. Warhol was stung to the quick by the rejection, but turned the humiliating episode into the occasion of his first art exhibit in New York, which opened on June 16, 1952, under the title 15 Drawings based on the writings of Truman Capote. None of the pieces sold.
His fascination with Truman Capote is a medium for him, is a kind of conduit for him for becoming an artist, for becoming a certain kind of artist. And he pursues that relentlessly throughout his life. It could be Edie Sedgwick or it could be Truman Capote. But they're really not the objects of his desire so much as the medium of his desire. Central to all of it was his art, was how you create yourself, how you transform yourself. Whatever you are deep down, it's how you become what you become.
He was still recovering from the Capote disaster in the spring of 1952, when the doorbell rang one evening in his second-floor apartment on East 75th Street. Down on the steps below, he found his mother Julia carrying 2 heavy suitcases, an armload of shopping bags, and the news that she had sold the family house back on Dawson Street and come to New York to live with her youngest son. At least until he found a nice girl, she said, settled down, and started a family. Worried about how his mother would fit into his new way of life, Warhol reluctantly agreed to let her stay, just until he got a burglar alarm, he said. In the end, the two would live together for the next 20 years, until just before her death in 1972. During that time, though he would keep her largely screened from public view, and never fully outgrow the embarrassment he felt about her broken English and old-world ways, he would come to depend on her, both for her housekeeping skills and her artistic sensibility, often pressing her into service, coloring in and hand-lettering his commercial prints, as well as the private drawings and handmade booklets he sometimes gave out to clients.
She won an award for a record cover design as Andy Warhol's mother. She copied in her wonderful handwriting prose text about a street artist named Moondog for Prestige album cover, and on the album cover it said Andy Warhol's mother.
Almost immediately, the advantages of the arrangement became patently clear. With Julia around to manage the household and help out with his art, he was free to work even longer hours, increase the number of assignments he took on, and bring in more money than ever.
And he was doing illustrations at that time, but very successfully working for a very famous ad agency, making really quite a lot of money, and he was celebrated as a graphic artist, but enormously interested in the art world.
You cannot be famous as a commercial artist. You're known in the field, right, no matter how successful. And he hungered for fame.
Eager to find a larger audience for his distinctive private drawings, he took his portfolio to dozens of galleries around the city, but no one would take his work. I was well known as a commercial artist, he recalled, but if you wanted to be considered a serious artist, you weren't supposed to have anything to do with commercial art.
He had given a group of paintings to Philip Pearlstein to take to the Tanninger Gallery, which was a cooperative gallery that all the Abex painters were involved with. A series of paintings of boys kissing boys. And Philip Pearlstein, I must say, as a good friend, brought them there. And of course they, thought this was just absurd.
Everything about his work, its figural style, commercial provenance, and homoerotic edge, doomed it in the world of fine art, which had been dominated since the end of the war by the sternly anti-figural precepts of abstract expressionism.
By the 50s, abstract expressionist painting was very much the house style. It was very much the national style. It was very much the international style. And it rested, of course, on three things, perhaps. Its abstractness, its absence of a knowable or recognizable image, on its visual painterliness, but most important, on its revelation of the interiority, the soul, the spirit of the artist. Great art was supposed to be like that, was supposed to be about that. Warhol's art was quite visibly not about any of those things. Although I think it's very much about the artist as well.
I think there was a sense, the myth, whether it was true or not, the myth was that the abstract expressionists were a set of tough, hard-drinking heterosexuals. And here was Andy, this shy, fey homosexual.
And the whole rhetoric of abstract expressionists was all about the struggle to express yourself in this effeminate commercial culture, you see.
In the end, the only places willing to show his work were a fashionable ice cream parlor on the Upper East Side called Serendipity that also served as a meeting place for gay men, and a little-known gallery right next door called the Bodley, where in the winter of 1956, a sample of his boy book drawings went on display without attracting a single customer. Oh my God, Warhol lamented, bombed again. His love life, meanwhile, was faring no better. In the summer of 1956, on a 2-month trip to the Far East with a handsome set designer named Charles Lisenby, his infatuated attempts to consummate their relationship were pointedly rejected in a hotel room in Honolulu. On their return to New York, heartbroken and humiliated by the experience, Warhol picked up his bags at the airport and walked off without saying goodbye or once looking back. He had gone around the world with a boy, he later told a friend, and not even received one kiss.
I was walking in Bali, and I saw a bunch of people in a clearing having a ball because somebody they really liked had just died. And I realized that everything was just how you decided to think about it. Sometimes people let the same problems make them miserable for years when they should just say, so what? That's one of my favorite things to say. So what? I don't know how I made it through all the years before I learned to do that trick. It took a long time for me to learn it, but once you do, you never forget.
Well, people say that Andy stopped caring after that. It seems a little bit like a myth. It meant that he gave up his sentimental strategies of the 50s in favor of a colder, more mechanical style in the 60s. I think he realized that he could master the world by seeming not to wish to master it. I mean, he conquered a paradox by stopping to care.
As the 1950s came to a close, Warhol's career seemed to have reached a kind of impasse, personally and artistically. By 1959, after 10 years in New York, he was without question the most well-known, highly paid, and sought-after commercial artist in the city. Before the year was out, he would purchase an entire 4-story townhouse on Lexington Avenue on the Upper East Side, installing his mother in the basement, and filling the upstairs rooms with his burgeoning collection of fine prints and paintings, including works by Picasso, Magritte, Miro, Klee, and Braque. By then, however, a crucial transformation had begun to take place in his own work as an artist, the harbinger of far more radical changes that would soon begin to sweep across the landscape of American culture in the 1960s.
That the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
There's going to be a new movement and a new kind of person, he repeatedly told his friends. And you could be that person. They always say that time changes things, he added, but you actually have to change them yourself. In the months and years to come, as one of the most dramatic and eventful decades in the history of American culture got underway, the force of those changes would catapult Warhol to the very center of the art world, dramatically transform the meaning and practice of art in America, and alter forever the way people grasped the world around them.
These things happen periodically in the culture. You know, human culture and planetary culture is organic. It goes through refreshing periods, and then it gets stale. So what you call like a revolutionary thing is really just a new, fresh plant growing up, and pushing the other aside. And the coming together in the 60s of the stars, New York as the center of the art world, a new generation of American artists who were really brilliant and geniuses and ingenious, all struck.
I think that's one of the things that people forget, is that real paradigm shifts in the art world completely redo it. Just as the world of the abstract expressionists destroyed all the previous galleries, destroyed all the previous dealers, marginalized all the culture as it exists, and put themselves in power, so the world of pop and minimalism did the same thing. It wasn't just new artists, it was new dealers, new collectors, new everything. Andy understood that you don't change the art, you change the society, and it's what art does. I mean, part of the function of art, I think, is to change society, but it can only do that by changing art society.
The first distant rumblings had come in the winter of 1958, when a 28-year-old painter named Jasper Johns sent shockwaves rippling through the art world with his first one-man show at Leo Costelli's gallery on East 77th Street. Featuring hand-painted images of everyday objects, the show was an instant sensation and sold out almost overnight. 2 months later, Jasper Johns' close friend and lover, Robert Rauschenberg, had his own one-man show at the Costelli Gallery, featuring images drawn from newspapers, magazines, street signs, and advertisements. At a stroke, the fortress of abstraction had started to crumble.
Jasper Johns and Bob Rauschenberg were kind of the bridge figures out of first-generation abstract expressionism into the pop style. I mean, when you consider those little sculptures of Jasper's that he did in the middle 50s, early on, a Saffron coffee can with paintbrushes, the 2 ale cans, the route from those sculptures into the soup can becomes more obvious.
Sometime probably as early as 1958, Warhol had decided that he was going to become not just a painter, but he was going to become an avant-garde painter. He was going to become a painter like Jasper Johns, like Robert Rauschenberg, like Frank Stella.
To Warhol's dismay, however, Johns and Rauschenberg would have nothing to do with him, in part because of his commercial background, which they shared but openly disdained, and in part because of his sexuality, which they also shared, but which, to protect their careers, they kept carefully screened from public view. After repeated attempts to approach the new stars ended in failure, Warhol turned to a close mutual friend, Emile d'Antonio, in despair. "Why don't they like me?" he asked. "Why can't I see them? Why can't I be a painter?" "Because you're a commercial artist," d'Antonio replied, "and because you're too swish and campy."
There was nothing I could say to that. It was all too true. I decided I just wasn't going to care, because those were all things that I didn't want to change, that I didn't think I should want to change. Dee was the only person I knew then who could see past those old social distinctions to the art itself.
Very clearly, from the beginning of his painting career, he goes to a subject matter that's vernacular. He goes to images that appear in the press. And by early '61, Warhol was creating the first paintings that we would come to think of as his pop paintings. But it's a very decisive moment in his career.
In the winter of 1961, on the second floor of his townhouse on Lexington Avenue, he set to work. Beginning as Johns and Rauschenberg had, with pre-existing images and vernacular subjects, from the very start he showed a willingness to go much farther than his predecessors. Seeking out the cheapest and most bluntly graphic images he could find, crudely drawn black and white ads for nose jobs, wigs, television sets, refrigerators, storm doors, and foot medications, clipped from tabloid newspapers and downmarket magazines, and from the back pages of comic books.
The popular fantasy is that the artist is this Promethean inventor who, out of nothing, invents and creates. And Andy was the exact reverse of that. He was pure receptivity. He's receptive to everything, and then something happens. He chooses.
He's the reverse of an expressionist painter. He's the reverse of somebody who imposes himself, his pattern, his vision, his energy, whatever it is, on things. As I say, he's a recording machine, and I think that's what's different. I think that he's a mirror. He reflects life rather than sort of projecting life.
How he begins to make paintings is very interesting because technically, in many ways, it's of a piece with how he made drawings. He always works from a found image. Initially, he uses illustrations, a line illustration. There's no tone, there's no shadow. They're stark, black and white, line-cut images, usually taken from advertisements. And he enlarges the image in an opaque projector, projects the image on the wall, and he would literally trace the projected image on the wall, sometimes using pencil, but initially painting freehand over the projected image.
I mean, I think he was steeped in film culture and the culture of products and consumption, and he was populist enough or common enough or grounded enough to take that realm ultra seriously. I think it's because he had a terrific eye, was in some sense an art director or a window dresser or a manager of environments before he was a fine artist. And so he knew all about the hook, the seduction, the subliminal ploy to draw somebody in. And he had done a lot of research in American looking, American desire.
During this time that Warhol's making these works, he hasn't given up his day job. I mean, he's still doing commercial design. He's still doing window design. He worked for Bonwit Teller department store and did a number of windows. Every year, the commercial artists would be given a show, if they wanted, of the work they were doing in their serious time. So Warhol did a selection of these hand-painted images. Little King, an advertisement painting, made their first appearance, fittingly one could say, in Bonwit Teller's store.
He had been working in a vacuum for nearly a year, unsold and all but unexhibited, when he was introduced to two men destined to play a crucial role in the pop art movement. Ivan Karp, a dapper, fast-talking assistant to the art dealer Leo Costelli, who tried without success to convince his employer to take Warhol on, and Henry Geldzahler, a brilliant 29-year-old curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who would become one of pop art's most ardent champions.
When I saw Warhol, Lichtenstein, Oldenburg, and Wesselmann within a 4-month period, I had a sitting up in bed kind of feeling, thinking something very strange was going on in the art world. Ivan Karp.
From the start, it was clear to both Karp and Geldzahler that Warhol had the talent and temperament to go much farther than any of the others.
The radical thing that takes place is he makes a series of pictures in which he eliminates the drip, the brushwork. And this is the thing that he's most uncertain about. And he even said, but can a painting be a painting if it doesn't have drips? So he invites 4 people to his studio: Emile D'Antonio, Irving Blum, Ivan Karp, and Henry Geldzahler. And he shows them the messy version and the tight version. And every one of them prefers the tighter version. In looking at a pristine version of the Coca-Cola painting, D'Antonio remarks, "Andy, it's naked, it's brutal, it's who we are." You know, this is something that looks more like his commercial art than it does what he thought high art should be about. And this is radical for him.
By 1962, he's virtually expunged all brush marks from his painting. They become increasingly non-painterly. They also become increasingly flat in the sense that color is applied without any medium tones. They're applied in pure hues. There's no shade, there's no space in the paintings. There's no space for our eye to move through it like a traditional painting or even like an abstract painting. And there's no place for our spiritual eye to penetrate it. We're just thrown back on the surface.
It's impossible for us to imagine how radical and how risky it must have been at that time to make these kind of works. To, you know, slap an image of a comic strip or a Coca-Cola bottle on a canvas is a very radical and in-your-face act.
From the start, the response of most members of the art world to Warhol's work was almost uniformly hostile. "I thought the paintings were terrible," one gallery owner said. "I thought they were ridiculous." Warhol himself, another dealer observed, looked like something that had crawled out from under a rock. He was the most colossal creep I had ever seen in my life. Despite Karp and Geldzahler's zealous efforts on his behalf, no dealers were willing to exhibit his work.
There are still artists and still people in the art world who feel that everything he did was anathema to art, that it killed the spirit in art. There was the flatness of the technique, the fact that it was not painterly. And most people saw that as a kind of blasphemy. Many people who were involved in making art felt that this was basically anti-art.
Even sympathetic visitors, like Irving Blum, a gallery owner from Los Angeles, were baffled by what they saw.
And I went to see him. He was doing these big, unfinished cartoon paintings. There was a pile of them, and I couldn't make head or tail out of them. I remember very distinctly I was confused and not engaged. Not engaged. However, engaged by the guy. At the beginning, at that time in his life, nothing if not completely accessible.
By the end of 1961, Warhol was the only member of the pop art movement whose works remained unshown. One night in early December, he outlined a situation to 2 close friends, Ted Carey and Muriel Latow, and asked them what to do. "It's too late for cartoons," he said. "I've got to do something that will have a lot of impact, that will be different from Lichtenstein and Rosenquist, that will be very personal, that won't look like I'm doing exactly what they're doing. Muriel, you've got fabulous ideas. Can you give me one?" Without missing a beat, Latow replied, "You like money," she said simply. "You should paint pictures of money." Then added, almost as an afterthought, "You should paint something that everybody sees every day, that everybody recognizes, like a can of soup." For the first time that evening, Warhol smiled. The next morning, dispatching Julia to the AMP with orders to bring back all 32 varieties of soup the Campbell's Soup Company made, he began to experiment with a variety of approaches, focusing in the end on what struck him as the simplest strategy: 32 separate single-can paintings, each showing a different variety of soup, painstakingly rendered in the style he had been perfecting for nearly a year. He would return to the subject again and again over the next few months.
The idea that the way you are induced to look at something is as much about making it art as what it is. That is to say, if the artist can make you look at anything as if it were art, it to some degree becomes art. If you contemplate a telephone, a glass of water, a light fixture, in the context of the highlighted uselessness of art, it will change its nature to your perception. That, in other words, perception is what makes art as much as whatever is inherent in the object you're looking at.
He was still working on the series one morning in early May 1962, when Irving Blum called to say that he was back in town.
He said, "Come over. I'd love to see you, Irving." And I walked in through the door, and in the corridor were several soup can paintings lined up on the floor. And I looked at them and said, "What are these?" And he said, "My new work. It's what I'm doing now. It's what I've been doing for a short while." And I said, "What happened to the cartoons?" And he said, "You know, Irving, I went to Leo's gallery, and Ivan Karp showed me some transparencies. And there's a guy doing these cartoons in a much more finished way than I was doing these cartoons of mine. In any case," he said, "I had the idea for these soups, and it's what I'm working on now." He said, "There are 32 varieties of Campbell's soup, chili beef, chicken, consommé, whatever." And he said, "I'm going to do 32, then figure out what I'm going to do next." And we continued to talk, and somehow I became engaged by them. And I said to Andy, "Would you be willing to show them in California?" He said, "Yes, let's do it." And that was how that happened.
The soup cans would prove to be the turning point of Andy Warhol's career, providing him with the unmistakable artistic signature he had been looking for. That month, as he prepared for his exhibit at the Ferris Gallery in July, Time magazine ran a full-page article about the pop art style, ridiculing the movement, but featuring a photograph of Warhol himself, standing in front of one of his paintings, pretending to sip Campbell's soup from a can. Over the next 3 months, as the fame he had longed for all his life began to build and grow, he would make the most important artistic breakthrough of his career, one that would permanently fuse the form and content of his art and give it permanent, lasting power.
There's something that almost never varies in Warhol's work from August of '62 until the day he dies, and that's the use of the photograph and the silkscreen technique. It's consistent throughout the '60s into the '70s and beyond. Of course, he had always been intimately involved with the world of reproduced images. And certainly by '62, he's very involved with this notion of repetition, with the image repeating again and again within the painting. We call it seriality. There's the frame of the painting, and then there's the repeating image of it.
He goes through a series of carved stamps, which he uses to make the S&H green stamp paintings, various stamp paintings, and then he begins to move to hand-cut stencils, where he actually would draw an image and then cut the stencil out. So it still isn't quite photographic now. It's still hand-drawn in this way, but it's moving in that direction.
Following the suggestion of his assistant, Nathan Gluck, he began sending out his drawings to be photomechanically silk-screened, a commercial technique that involved transferring an image onto a fine meshed screen through which ink could be pressed to produce an infinite number of copies. You get the same image, slightly different each time, he remembered. It was all so simple, quick and chancy. I was thrilled by it.
The first silkscreen paintings probably come from as early as April of 1962. These silkscreens were from illustrated material. He wasn't using photographs. He was using an illustration of a Coca-Cola bottle and of dollar bills. And he had to draw the dollar bill. He sent that to a silkscreen maker, and with these silkscreens, he made his first silkscreen paintings. By the summer of '62, the technique evolves. It evolves from drawing to the photograph. He learns that he can actually have a photograph reproduced photomechanically onto a silkscreen. As best as we can date it, Warhol says his first photo silkscreen painting was a painting called Baseball, and then the movie star paintings followed shortly afterwards. The paintings of Troy Donahue, teen stars, Warren Beatty, Natalie Wood.
That is the radical departure. Once he wed that silkscreen with the painting, once photography became embedded within painting in a way it had never been before, he never goes back to using those other techniques again. And this sets up a completely different way for him to operate and, in a sense, makes evident the source materials that he's been using all along. And this is fundamental. He marries form and content in a way that's inextricable. You cannot pull them apart. By the time you get to the silkscreen image and you actually look at something that exists in the culture through reproduction, exists in his painting as reproduction, you cannot tear it apart. And of course, that's the thing that really makes for great art. He pushed the language forward. That's the thing we want from great artists. And Warhol did that.
On July 9th, 1962, Warhol's Soup Can Show, his first major exhibit as a fine artist, opened at the Ferris Gallery in West Hollywood, to scanty sales, and at first, a deafening silence from the critics.
Zero. There was no critical response. I mean, the most entertaining critical response came from a guy called David Stewart, who had a gallery 3 doors away from where my gallery was, and he went to the local Safeway store, bought 20 Campbell soup cans, put them in the window, and said, "Buy them more cheaply here." In other words, 27 cents. But people were mystified or dismissive. But because the gallery was serious, people thought about them. But having more to do, I promise you, more to do with me and my reputation than with the paintings themselves. That was the mistake that was made.
In the end, something about the provocative paintings seemed to touch a deep and powerful chord. Here was an image, Henry Geldzahler declared, that became the overnight rallying point for the sympathetic and the bane of the hostile. Warhol captured the imagination of the media and the public as no other artist of his generation. Andy was Pop, and Pop was Andy. Most critics dismissed the paintings as a vulgar joke, but a young writer named John Copeland, founder of a new journal called Art Forum, praised them as the greatest breakthrough in art since the ready-mades of Marcel Duchamp, half a century earlier.
The power of the cans, first of all, in 100 years, you won't buy soup in cans. I mean, this defines a time. It tells you about marketing. It tells you about advertising. It tells you about food distribution. And I always found them, as I sat looking at them from time to time, for lack of anything else to do, complicated. In their implication. Complicated. And I find them to this day complicated in their implication. That was his genius. That was his genius, I think. And they really, more than any other image, more than any other symbol, define the pop style and 60s activity. They have a cerebral aspect, they have a literal aspect, like any great work of art, they're complex. After 10 days or 2 weeks into the exhibition, I called Andy and I said, the experience of living with the work has been so powerful to me for reasons I can't even tell you. I'm just struck by the paintings, Andy, in a way that I couldn't imagine at the beginning. But I can tell you that I think they're really powerful, and I think they're terribly important. And I'd like to keep the set intact. He said, Irving, they were conceived as a group, and he said, I'd love it if you could do it. And I said, I can promise you this, Andy. I can promise you I will never break them up. I will keep them intact. And I can also promise you, I don't know how we're going to do this, but I can promise you that one day they'll go to a great museum. I said, what will I have to pay you for the group? And he said, $1,000 for the 32 paintings. And over a 10-month period, I sent him $100 a month until I got to the end of it. Well, I can tell you exactly what they're worth now. I sold them 6 years ago for $15 million, intact, to the Museum of Modern Art, and they have them intact, just as I promised. In addition to the 32 paintings, which I showed in California, Andy did 4 or 5. One of them was auctioned off 2 nights ago at Christie's, the single painting, for $2,200,000. So, when you consider I had 32 times 2 million, plus the fact that they're intact has a value, my guess, and I don't think I exaggerate, would be a value of, I think, $100 million. In other words, I think they're invaluable. They're invaluable. They're irreplaceable and invaluable.
He just did it, and he didn't know how to do it. He had the drive, the desire, the need to be beyond anything. He had to be at least as great as Marilyn Monroe. He knew that's where power of life was, the burning flame. Because for so many years he was so plain and fascinated with beauty himself, and he knew that beauty has that magnetism that attracts people, and he didn't have that. So he developed another kind of magnetism, the stardom. Because there is real life power in fame and stardom. So that movie star in the spotlight, being a star and not wanting to go beyond that. And he eventually eclipsed the fame of his work with the fame of his individual nature.
What artist of any sort has had more to say about the nature of fame in the 20th century than Andy Warhol? It was one of his leading themes. It was one of his subjects in the most profound way. He thought about it with a depth and an originality and an insight, and showed it in his work with a kind of striking, inescapable force that's beyond that of any competitor I can think of. In addition, he was constantly focusing on what struck him as beautiful. He was an aesthete. He was somebody who was interested in what was beautiful. And what was beautiful shone for him. To shine like a star was to be beautiful. So beauty and fame went together in his mind. I think, in addition, it was a kind of immortality, a way of keeping going, of keeping the moment so it wouldn't vanish on you and disappear and be lost.
Over the next 18 months, as his own career took off with a speed and intensity unparalleled in the annals of contemporary culture, Andy Warhol would finish defining the major themes and subjects that would absorb the rest of his career. in one of the most astonishing bursts of artistic creativity in the 20th century.
So many of the paintings that we think of as the great paintings, of course, of the 60s, from the soup cans to the death paintings, the Marilyn paintings, were made before the factory. In the period 61, 63, there's a tremendous outpouring of work.
This is sort of the efflorescence of the first moment of celebrity culture. You know, I mean, the first moment in which we really let celebrities stand for us. You know, I can date it exactly. And I went to Andy's great year, 1962. For 40 years, Norman Rockwell had been painting pictures of everyday Americans. 1962, Andy starts painting pictures of presidents and heroes and movie stars.
On August 4th, 1962, the same day the Soup Can Show closed in West Hollywood, news flashed across the country that the actress Marilyn Monroe had committed suicide in her Brentwood home, just 3 miles away.
Hollywood history is dead at 36.
Warhol, acting on a suggestion of Henry Geldzahler, immediately decided to make the doomed star the subject of his next series of silkscreens.
I think that Andy had what Henry James called the imagination of disaster, and Henry Geldzahler saw it. Andy was always about listening to suggestions. He was always saying, I'm tabula rasa. Please fill me with something. Tell me something. Well, Henry fed him ideas. He fed him ideas about Marilyn. That is to say, why is timing everything? He set out on the Marilyn series the day Marilyn died.
Using a still from her 1953 film Niagara, he added a new twist to the silk screening technique, painting grounds of vivid color in the locations of her head, lips, and shoulders, then silk screening the black and white photograph over it.
What commentators have noticed is that the color comes first. The background color comes first, and the drawing comes second. It's just complete reversal of what the usual order of things in painting. There's underdrawing, and then you paint on top of it. Not Warhol. Warhol painted first, used color first, painted by hand, in fact, first, and then screened on top of it.
All through August and on into September, he painted one Marilyn after another, 23 in all, from a small single-image canvas known as Gold Marilyn, to an immense diptych with 100 images, half in color, half black and white, arrayed across a canvas nearly 12 feet wide. As with his blotted line technique before, random imperfections often crept into the work, marring the surface of each canvas. Background colors often failed to register with the photographic image, and through repeated use, the silk screens became clogged with paint, giving the doomed movie star a slightly different expression in each portrait. When Nathan Gluck pointed out the discrepancies, Warhol dismissed him. "I like it that way," he said. "It's part of the art."
Guess what Andy's genius was? That he had a way of making everything mean. Every detail means something. Every mark or splatter or sign of accident or lack of the hand or of intention in Warhol's symbolic universe has a meaning. And he was enough of a minimalist to leave objects alone so that they could speak their double or triple meanings.
What Andy understood is the painting of Marilyn Monroe doesn't necessarily just represent Marilyn, it represents you. Take the Lifesaver Marilyns. There's a mint one, there's a green one, there's an orange one, you know, all these different flavors. What this implies is we all want Marilyn. She's the object of our desire. We cannot have Marilyn, but we can have the picture of Marilyn that suits our taste. So in a sense, we are all one in our desire for what we can't have. We individuate ourselves in what color we want our desire to come in. And I think that was pretty much Andy's view of the thing. We all want Campbell's, some of us want the bean. You know what I mean? That's a pretty consistent language of imagery in Warhol. In other words, not that we get what we want, it's that everybody understands that we're wanting creatures and that we're one in that particular theater.
In the end, Marilyn was only the first of Warhol's extraordinary meditations on the function of fame in a mass society. grasping that stars were never truer to themselves than when the brilliance that sustained them began to fade away, he turned to his portraits of Elizabeth Taylor and the aftermath of her disastrous turn as Cleopatra, as her health deteriorated and her love life came apart and her career began to implode. I started those, he later said, when she was so sick and everybody thought she was going to die. Now I'm doing them all over, putting bright colors on her lips and eyes.
He understood all of the paradoxes of stardom, and he was the greatest philosopher of stardom that has ever lived, Andy Warhol was. Andy understood intuitively the implosiveness of one identity being made that big. It's the stuff of nightmares. I've often thought, what a nightmare to be Liz in a way and wake up one morning and go, oh my God, I'm known over the whole world, which is Andy's dream. But that's a kind of imperial conquest that decimates the world and also decimates the individual who is thus made available. One painting that I can think of quite vividly is Blue Liz as Cleopatra. And it's the way the image seems to be a film strip or just a strip of celluloid that can be read as continuous action if it were projected, but that's not being projected, so it's somehow discarded image. And a discarded image of a human being in motion, a desired, objectified, beautiful, famous human being in motion, turned into a series of still portraits and then discarded. It's outtake footage, it's mangled and ripped, it's censored footage, it's the stuff on the cutting room floor. It's literally in the dust heap. So Warhol takes Liz and he dyes her blue, and understanding that Liz is on the verge of becoming garbage, he's going to rescue her, rescue this strip, and render it as a painting. And essentially his sensibility is entirely mourning and melancholy. That Liz is lost. She's already lost. And she will never be found. She will never be there.
As summer turned to fall, his energies exploded, unleashed by the possibilities of the silkscreen technique and by the demands of preparing for not one but two major exhibitions later that fall. In 3 months, he completed more than 100 paintings. His studio, one man later said, looked and smelled as if it had been hit by a paint bomb. I feel very much a part of my times, of my culture, Warhol told a newspaper reporter in late September. As much a part of it as rockets or television.
That phrase, I am a camera, applied more to Andy than to anybody else. It wasn't just a camera. I mean, I am a recording machine. I am the mirror to the world. And any kind of recording of this incredibly dramatic period in our lives is enormously important. And I think Andy got it more graphically, more really than anybody else. That although there is this sort of mysterious sort of flimsiness to his work, there is a kind of reality. He got it. He got it by accepting it and by letting it impress itself on him, on his work, on everything about him. And who else has done that?
He wanted to steal as much reality as possible. He was voracious and acquisitive toward reality, because at every moment good art is happening to our right and left, and we're missing it.
On October 31st, 1962, the first group show of the pop art movement opened at the Janus Gallery. 1 week later, on November 6th, 1962, Warhol's first one-man show in New York opened at the Stable Gallery on West 58th Street and took the world by storm. Gathering together 18 of his best paintings to date, it established him almost overnight as first among equals in the pop art movement, and as one of the most important figures in contemporary American art. Henry Geldzahler, Ivan Karp, and Emile D'Antonio were all there, vindicated in their tenacious belief in his talent. Leo Castelli stood in a corner, his eyes narrowed, acknowledging that he had been profoundly mistaken about Warhol's prospects. Alone amidst the revelry and high spirits, Warhol himself seemed distant and withdrawn, remaining in a corner of the gallery for most of the evening, his face unusually blank.
His eyes were soft, expressive. They were the eyes of a fragile night creature who has discovered himself living in the blaze of an alien but fascinating world.
Even critics skeptical of his earlier work now began to acknowledge the sheer pictorial power of the new images. Warhol's paintings, the writer Ron Sukanik declared, represented America's first real break with European ideals. The images of Marilyn, he added, were about as sentimental as Fords coming off the assembly line. Each one a different color, but each one the same as every other.
We were seeing the future, and we knew it for sure. We saw people walking around in it without knowing it, because they were still thinking in the past, in the reference of the past. But all you had to do was know you were in the future, and that's what put you there. The mystery was gone, but the amazement was just starting.
I think Andy wanted to be remembered by history. He wanted to be the most important artist of his time. He wanted to be Picasso. He was kind of obsessed with competing with Picasso on many levels. I think his motivation was part superficial and part frivolous, personal, and part very noble in a way, you know. He really wanted to record the times. He really wanted to figure it out. He really wanted to leave something.
With his artwork in demand as never before, Warhol resolved to step up production. In January 1963, he moved his studio from the parlor of his townhouse, no longer large enough to accommodate his larger paintings, to the third floor of an abandoned red brick firehouse a few blocks away on East 87th Street. In June, to increase production still further, he took on a new assistant, a 20-year-old college student from the Bronx named Gerard Malanga, who had learned how to silkscreen a few years before while working for a necktie manufacturer.
The more you look at Warhol's work, the more you look at Warhol, the more you see a mind constantly engaged in the studio. We see him making a series of decisions in the studio, how one painting leads to another painting, how one series leads to another painting. And there are a series of insights, and you get a sort of logic almost that unfolds in the studio that's of an intensely committed and engaged, sophisticated and thoughtful artist. A series of images follow that are a series of action images, narrative images. The paintings that we've come to call the death paintings. It's probably not long after Marilyn's suicide in August of '62 when he begins to do his first paintings of car crashes. And he comments in a very famous interview that he turns on the radio, it's a holiday, and he hears about death everywhere. Mundane death as a highway fatality.
Henry Geldzahler fed him the idea of the disaster series. These horrible photographs that used to appear in the tabloid newspapers of New York of these grotesque, horrible accidents transformed into this arresting, unforgettable series. Now, where does that come from? I mean, I can talk about where it comes from philosophically, but it also was always there. Someone who was that tuned to the immediate moment. Timing is everything. What makes him act? A suggestion about death. You should do these pictures, Andy. Probably Henry Geldzahler has said it to him 200 times, but that one worked.
I wanted Andy to get serious, Henry Geldzahler recalled. I said, it's enough life. It's time for a little death.
I thought that people should think about them sometime. The girl who jumped off the Empire State Building, or the ladies who ate the poisoned tuna fish, and the people getting killed in car crashes. It's not that I feel sorry for them. It's just that people go by, and it doesn't really matter to them that someone unknown was killed. So I thought it'd be nice for these unknown people to be remembered by those who ordinarily wouldn't think of them.
harsh and unnerving, based on photographs taken from news agencies, police files, and tabloid newspapers. The so-called death and disaster paintings were not immediately popular. Most gallery owners simply refused to exhibit them.
Most of Warhol's work has a very grim and terrible side. He never hid it. He never claimed anything other than that. But he himself seemed touched with magic. He had found a way to overcome these tremendous, obvious liabilities and flourish in this culture and be someone who seemed like he had put himself into the realm of the blessed. And yes, I think because that was connected to him, the grim message of a lot of his art was ignored in favor of the sort of with it, perfect, on top of it all look.
Andy's attitude toward women was very complicated. He admired them. He wanted to be one. He wanted to be involved in their creation. Ethel's skull 36 times was the most successful portrait of the 1960s. It was a new kind of look at a single human being from 36 different points of view, obviously influenced by cinema and television. He was creating an image of a superstar out of a woman who could have been any one of a series of women. Henry Geldzahler.
In the summer of 1963, he embarked on his first commissioned work, a portrait of the art collector Ethel Skull, based on a series of photographs he had made of her wearing outfits by Yves Saint Laurent.
I had great visions of going to Richard Avedon, see, having magnificent pictures of me taken, and then he would do the portrait. And so he came up for me that day, and he said, all right, we're off. And I said, well, where are we going? He says, down to 42nd Street and Broadway. I said, what are we going to do there? He says, I want to take pictures of you. I said, for what? He said, for the portrait. I said, in those things? I said, my God, I'll look terrible. He said, don't worry. And he took out, he had coins, about $100 worth of silver coins. He said, we'll take the high key and the low key, and I'll push you inside, and you'll watch the little red light. And I froze.
Now start smiling and talking, Warhol told his willing client, as he began dropping quarters into the machine. This is costing me money.
So Andy would come in and poke me and make me do all kinds of things. We were running from one booth to the other, and he took all these pictures, and they were drying all over the place. And at the end of the thing, he said, now you want to see them. And they were so sensational that you didn't need Richard Avedon, you see.
From the 300 images he took that day, he initially selected 35, enlarging, silkscreening, and individually inking each image, then adding one more to make an even 36. The finished work was so big, a friend remembered, it had to be assembled in place on the skull's living room wall.
But what I liked about it mostly was that it was a portrait of being alive and not like those candy box things which I detest, you see. I never ever wanted a portrait of myself. And he was very clever because he knows I'm nearsighted. I wear sunglasses. And he said, let's have them with the glasses and without the glasses. And he directed me, I tell you, in those days he should have already been in the movies, you know, or doing movies.
By probably the middle of '63, there's another insight that starts happening, and it changes the whole way he begins to think about the serial or repetitive nature of the image. Which is to say, rather than producing a single large painting in which the image repeats again and again, he begins to create single images that are smaller and assemble them together in series. It gives him a lot more flexibility, and in fact, he can create many more paintings. And in fact, he can totally undermine any idea of composition. There is no composition in advance. There is just the montage, just how you put the units together.
Increasingly now, his interests were moving towards film. In July, he bought a second-hand Bolex and convinced a friend to let him film him while he slept. That fall, Irving Blum asked him to put on a second show in Los Angeles.
He said, for the '63 show, why don't we ring the gallery with Elvis's? And he said, you have a space behind the gallery. We can show Liz Taylor portraits, which I'm doing now, back there. So it would be a kind of a dialogue between these two people. And he said, I think it might work very well. And I told him I thought it would be brilliant. And at a moment, a big coffin-like crate arrived, and it was an unbroken roll of Elvis images. And I called Andy and I said, how do I handle this? And he said, you cut them. I've sent you another crate of stretcher bars. And he said, I've printed it so that there are single images, double images, and triple images of Elvis. And he said, Irving, cut them. And I said, cut them. He said, yes, cut them. He said, cut them on the ground. He said, don't cut the image. And I said, right. And that's exactly what I did. And hung them cheek by jowl around the gallery. People hated it. They hated it. And I had the Liz Taylor's 10 identical paintings on a silver ground, black hair, flesh-colored face, all screened, however, each one subtly different. And incredibly powerful and really amazing to see.
While he was in Hollywood, he shot footage for a silent film called Tarzan and Jane, featuring Dennis Hopper and the underground film star Taylor Mead. Hopper himself threw a glamorous star-studded party for him with a guest list that included Sal Mineo and Troy Donahue. It was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him, Warhol later said, and he returned to New York more starstruck than ever. Being a star was an absolute dream of his, a friend recalled. But he didn't want to just be a movie star. He wanted to be the head of the studio.
I think he was inspired by the underground film scene in New York, which he was very tuned into. He understood that film had entered the hands of artists and was available to him. And as he began to tap film imagery in his paintings, and as he began to, one could say, get in touch with his inner star and began to realize his own dream of stardom, probably became piercingly clear that he needed to make movies as a way of being the movies. So it seems to me unsurprising that he would wish to make films himself.
On the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, Warhol was walking through Grand Central Station when news flashed across the country that President Kennedy had been shot an hour before, while on a political tour of Dallas. Rushing uptown, he sat stunned on a couch, watching the live television coverage unfold in real time, unable to hold back tears. "I don't know what it means," one friend remembered him saying over and over again. In the months to come, selecting 8 grainy images of the president's widow just before and after her husband's murder, he would create an extended series of single and multiple image paintings. One 16-panel composition in particular would capture, as perhaps no other artwork of the time, the profound cultural and psychic rupture John F. Kennedy's assassination represented.
He understood instantaneously. The second Liz turned into Liz, which was with her tracheotomy and her sexual scandals in the early 60s, and with Jackie, the second JFK was shot, just to understand that instantly they were incomprehensible spectacles that would make one speechless to contemplate, and he got that immediately.
He was able to grasp via something like the Jacqueline Kennedy portrait that America lives in terms of images, right? And that woman, you know, in mourning, the famous one of her with the head down, that she held the nation together for 3 terrifying days when it was very vulnerable by her image in mourning, right? He understood this and he captured it and reproduced it.
For 2 more years, Warhol would continue working at the top of his form as a pop painter and continue producing masterpieces on canvas to the end of his life. And yet already, by the end of 1963, the focus of his interests had begun to shift. In the months and years to come, as the centrifugal energies of the 1960s began to pick up speed, he would begin to move into the deeper dimensionality of sculpture and into the deeper temporality of film. As he did, the setting in which he produced his art would shift as well, from the semi-isolation of the firehouse studio to the dizzyingly complex social universe of a new kind of workplace, the factory, which would become not only the setting in which his art was created, but itself the most radical, ambiguous, and troubling work of art he ever made.
Well, whatever comes along. And like somebody called up yesterday, a girl, and she said, I have a script called Up Your Ass. And I thought the title was so great, and I was so friendly, I just told her to come up. But she still, you know, we haven't seen her yet, so I don't know. Again.
She thought that would be just the thing for Andy.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know.
Without really knowing what that means, or I think really knowing what your work is about. I'd like to try to talk some more about the paintings and the things you did earlier, because there's something that I think needs to be explained for the public, which has at this point a certain...
Next time on American Masters, Andy Warhol steers pop culture as filmmaker,
reinventing cinema,
star maker,
Andy became famous by making other people famous.
and ringmaster till it all goes bad.
And to use these people for his art.
Andy Warhol, a documentary film directed by Rick Burns, continues next time on American Masters. To learn more about Andy Warhol, visit pbs.org. Andy Warhol is available on DVD for $24.99. A CD soundtrack is available for $16.98 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
Things like
maybe this is really bourgeois of me, but we want fuller lives, and we want to know the meanings of the things that drive our lives. We want to redeem the garbage in our life. That seems to me, that's why I look at art. And the thing I feel when I look at Warhol is maximum redemption of lost material. He puts meaning back where there is deadness, I think. It's not that he reproduces a banalized, commodified experience, but that he puts something back into it. Color, sequence, gravity, iconic stature, gold. He puts all sorts of things back into it. He puts repetition and the pleasure of repetition, the pleasure of making one thing and then another and not discarding either one of them. He puts that back into human experience. And art took that out a long time ago when it separated the artists from the non-artists. And there were some who got to make pretty things and others who could at best be pretty things or buy pretty things. And Andy said, oh no, you can actually make them. You can be a non-artist who is the world's greatest artist. And that's why he's controversial. He is a non-artist. He's not an artist in a funny way. And he's the greatest artist. And that's why he matters, I think. That he's sort of Oprah language. He's empowering. You know, do it yourself. That's one of his paintings. I think it's a huge motto of his to seize the means of production. But isn't that what the proletariat is supposed to do? And isn't that what Andy did when he made films? Everything he did seemed to be about seizing the means of reproduction. And it's a power move.
I love the generosity of Andy's work. And I look at it and I think that it's about playing God. It's about creating life. It's about that spark of trying to just, in the most economical means, to just get a little bit ahead of life itself. But I think Andy was really about finding grace and about sharing acceptance. You know, the art in Andy's work is about sharing where we are. It's like, you know, giving us our parameters and giving us more. It's that increase of really the possibilities. And for that moment, you know, he's a great alchemist. At that moment, we are greater than we've ever been.
So there's popping in out of cubism and collage, but it's because it's a master artist who sees this and understands it. It's the design that went into that in the manufacturing process is so exquisite, and it's just a pack of cigarettes. But if you really look at it, it's a master crafted art piece. In the 60s, the whole world became exposed like that. And that was the gist of what pop was in America here, that everything became art. Walking down the street, all of a sudden the fire hydrant is so beautiful, and you see it's connecting this with your life. And then when all the LSD stuff started going around, everybody got into the hallucinogen thing, you could see that the fire hydrant was alive. And it never goes away once you get it.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, you really got me now.
Andy's ideas were brilliant, but not inexhaustible. Sooner or later, there's going to be a problem. You're going to fall into the classic trap of self-imitation. I'll do it like I did last time. And I think that he knew that. He understood that he had exhausted the vein that he discovered in pop art. That's why the film was so important for him, because it gave him a new place to take his visual and graphic genius. Stravinsky is said to have been asked once, what do you do when you run out of ideas? What do you do when you don't know what you're going to do next? And he answered, I wait as an insect waits. And then jump. Andy waited and waited, and then something would happen, and he'd jump. And enough was happening all the time, so that he had endless productivity. He was a demon worker, absolutely demon worker. One of the reasons he became an amphetamine addict was so he could stay up all night working. Not all night partying, working.
He was making movies nonstop, especially The Silver Factory. It was almost a 24-hour place. If Andy would go home, Undine and those people would still be there shooting up speed, making movies. You know, it was a very open, free-floating kind of creativity going on.
I mean, he was a lunatic in a way. He controlled a whole bunch of people in the factory. It was an extraordinary place. There must have been 15 or 20 people there. A lot of them on their way down destroyed people. And it was sort of a halfway house. And perhaps what drove Andy was really to be in that position, a voyeur, and to use these people for his art.
I call myself Andy Warhol now.
What's about the film? What's the film about?
It's called Blonde on a Bum Trip. What's it about?
It's
about a naive young lady who goes to Hollywood to make it big.
Andy was attracted to self-destructive people. Andy was attracted to addicts in a way. Andy liked people who were extremely one thing or another. He always said that he liked beauties and talkers. He liked people who looked good, or he liked people who could talk a lot and have these very sort of extreme personalities. They were the raw material of his films, of his art in that sense. But I think those people, you know, burn out. Drag queens, I don't think, have the world's greatest life expectancy rate.
There were a lot of destructive people around. And they were destructive of others and destructive of themselves. It was going on constantly. And Warhol has been many times reproached with some justice for having let it happen. And he needed them, among other things, artistically. He needed them because he needed ideas. He was the receiver of ideas. He was not the generator of ideas. He was the receiver of ideas. Something would come by him and it would work for him. And he would do it. What he was trying to do was bring in the whole world until something hit and happened. He was receptive in a way that meant a kind of absolute openness to him. But sooner or later, it was going to have to get really hairy. And it did. I think the narrative was, if you let in everyone, you let in madness too. And in it came.
I suppose there's also the Jesus narrative that becomes more evident retrospectively. You know, looking backward from the Last Supper paintings through his assassination or near assassination, sense of Andy as martyr, scarified body, gunshot wounds. Also the sense that part of the Jesus narrative or the martyr narrative is a sense of Andy being a representative man who has to take on the sufferings of mankind, or whose plight is symbolic and universal, and that it's somehow altruistic for him to endure his tribulations because he's doing it for other people. That there's often a sense that Andy picked on others or abused others. I think the story is really more that Andy felt himself to be the martyr or the victim.
On the surface, Andy was so cool, so heartless, but I somehow sensed that underneath there was always this kind of pain, this ultra-sensitivity, this hypersensitivity, you know? Because he was so sensitive. He saw it all, he knew, I mean, he felt, he could read between the lines of what everybody was saying. I think it's like everything kind of came together in Andy, you know? And it was a burden for him.
You want me to tell you about him?
Oh, go ahead.
Anything Andy does is fantastic because he's a saint.
A saint?
Yes.
Saint Andy the First.
He really loves people. So anything he does is beautiful because he sees the best in everybody. He sees God wherever he looks and in whoever he looks at. So that's why they call it art, because he's just very good, you know. It's very pure. So they call it art. That's what they call art. And something just done with a touch of divinity.
Fudge.
One of the things that Warhol understood that a lot of great business people understand is you can't lead in America. You can't get up in front with a flag and make people go anywhere. What you do is you move to the edge, declare that the center, and let everybody reorganize the world around you. And in a sense, that's what Warhol did. He created a center that was on the edge, but basically the world would reorganize its way around it.
At the end of January '64, Warhol found a new studio. He needed a different space. There's a simple entry in his day books where he kept a record of all his expenses. New studio, I think the date is January 24th or January 26th, and the address, 231 East 47th Street. This is the studio that became, or would become, the factory.
The factory, how to explain the impact of what it felt like is really rare, something that probably hasn't happened in this century in the art scene. It was just the ultra salon, but in the days of acid trips, you know. It was high-powered lightning bolts, Velvet Underground, Andy Warhol, superstars, all in like a 3-year period. It was a peak. Anyone who came to New York from Europe, the Stones had you gotta go to the factory, you know, or from California, Jim Morrison comes, you gotta go to the factory, you know, someone would bring you to the factory. if you were famous at any rate. It was just the burner was always on.
The factory was a very porous social space. It's where Warhol worked, it's where he made his paintings, where he made his films, and it's also where he received people. It becomes the center then of his public life, and his public life includes his work life. And that's, I think, one of the great changes that's taking place right now is how Warhol totally gets the idea of sociability and art, that they're not exclusive operations, and how the social and the personal and the interpersonal permeate his art, as indeed I think they always have, because I think his art was always about feelings, how people feel, how people respond, and how they respond to one another. The films certainly bring this into the foreground, bring this into high relief. And at the very beginning, he invites a young man named Billy Linnick, who became known as Billy Name, to decorate the space, make it silver.
Somebody brought Andy over to this haircutting salon type thing that I was doing. And he was so taken by my apartment, he said, "Oh, Billy, I just got this big new loft space uptown. Would you do this to my new loft, you know, the silver thing?"
It was a perfect time to think silver. Silver was the future. It was spacey. The astronauts wore silver suits, and their equipment was silver too. And silver was also the past, the silver screen. Hollywood actresses photographed on silver sets. And maybe more than anything else, silver was narcissism. Mirrors were backed with silver. Andy Warhol.
In January 1964, armed with an industrial staple gun, rolls of aluminum foil, and dozens of cans of silver spray paint, Billy Linnick got to work, devoting most of the next 4 months to transforming the dark and dingy industrial space, using his skills as a lighting technician to rewire the lighting system. Within a few weeks, the shy and quietly reliable Linnick had taken up unofficial residence in the new space. For the next 5 years, he would serve as the factory's unofficial manager, custodian, and gatekeeper, sleeping at night in a makeshift nest in one of the 2 small bathrooms in back, while each day hosting a steady stream of flamboyant downtown friends, most of whom shared his love of grand opera, wildly excessive gesture, and methamphetamine or speed.
I am always accused of bringing the criminal underground drug culture into the factory scene. And it's true, I did. Because Andy was sort of shy and careful about who he knew, but because I was competent, he trusted me implicitly to be able to control whatever situation I allowed to happen. And so I brought this element up to the factory with me. And Undine was probably the prime exponent of it because he was flamboyant and outgoing and I was very shy and behind the scenes type guy. But all of those extremes were these people that I knew from the village who were the mole people or the amphetamine people, and they were all brilliant.
Prominent among the factory hangers-on were a charismatic, non-stop verbal pyrotechnician named Robert Olivo, who called himself Undine, after the female lead in an experimental French play. A talented, desperately self-destructive dancer named Freddie Herco, and Bridget Berlin, the often abusively hot-tempered daughter of the chairman of the Hearst publishing empire. Over the next 5 years, thanks to Warhol's steadily increasing fame, the factory would gather in a cast of extreme characters from downtown, including a roster of drug addicts and drag queens, like Candy Darling, Rotten Rita, and Holly Woodlawn, a transvestite hustler who liked to describe herself as a disgrace to the world's oldest profession.
The thing that I thought was most interesting about it is that the dominant people in the scene were all of these working class drag queens. You know, you got Undine, you got Candy and these people, and yeah, they're drag queens, but they're also like working class dudes from Queens and Brooklyn, you know. The interesting thing, I think, if you look at that crowd in the factory, very few products of American middle-class culture. You got the top, you got the bottom. You got the drag queens, you got the flower children from, Harvard and Stanford. And so that tonality of it was like really strange.
I don't really feel all these people are hanging around me, Warhol once remarked. I'm more hanging around them.
He had a great eye for talent. One of his many talents was spotting people. He would spot people that were interesting and powerful. And once he made a decision about them, you were in. That made these people who had spent most of their lives being rejected and treated as scum feel pretty good. They couldn't wait to gather around. It was the great good place. It was the other world where you could go and everything would be good. You could be a freak. You could be out of it. So he created this place where the misbegotten of the world could all gather and feel great.
I think in a sense, the factory was a microcosm of what went on in the 60s, the confusion, the anti-establishment marches, protests, the insistence of the individual, the sense of getting away from the normal. All of that was part of what Andy stood for. Excess, drugs, speed, except not by him, but by everybody around him.
Always hypersensitive to the effect of any drug, Warhol himself rarely took anything stronger than a diet pill called Obitrol. And even then, never more than a quarter of a pill a day. Though that was enough, he recalled, to give you that wired, happy, go, go, go feeling in your stomach that made you want to work, work, work.
I think that was really the period in his life where he just decided to redo himself utterly, and he became a whole different person. There were a lot of people in his life who he knew before that didn't fit into that world very well. I certainly didn't, and didn't want to. He was so different that it was as though he couldn't be his old self anymore. Carl Willers.
Little by little, as he moved further and further into the spotlight of his own increasing celebrity, the boyish, faintly elfin and open vulnerability of his younger days began to give way to an increasingly inscrutable public persona, modeled in part on the hip and sometimes sullen outward demeanor of Billy Lenox mole people.
I don't really understand.
Once voluble enough, he rarely laughed or spoke in public now, and when he did, adopted a strange, emotionless voice that some compared to Jackie Kennedy's public speaking style.
I'm so empty today, I can't think of anything. Why don't you just tell me the words and they'll just come out of my mouth? No, don't worry about it, because no, I think it'd be so nice.
At the same time, his studied insistence on his own shallowness now reached a new extreme. If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, he insisted, just look at the surface of my paintings and my films, and there I am. There's nothing behind it.
See, he was two different people. If you want to get really simplistic, there was the public persona and then there was a private persona. He always said he couldn't draw, okay? But he was a great draftsman at the same time. You know, he said he couldn't read or didn't like to read. He read all the time. He was a good conversationalist, but then in public, the screen went down and his persona that he created, this artwork of himself, comes forward.
And then you made,
and then I made,
things like
an effacement of personality, which was at the same time an assertion of personality. And he got that right away, because he was a very smart guy. You know, if I pretend to have no personality at all, I'll be Andy Warhol. And that's more powerful. What you mustn't do is try to have a personality, put on an act, because I don't know how to put on an act. So put on no act. Just let it all fade away. And that worked for him. And it was a very interesting insight into the nature of the personality in a world of personalities and celebrities.
Nothing that had come before in Warhol's career could could have prepared the world for the astonishing burst of creative energy that began to explode from the factory almost as soon as he took occupancy in the waning days of January 1964. From the start, the sheer size of the new space, nearly 5,000 square feet in all, made it possible to contemplate entirely new kinds of projects, faster in number and vaster in scale. And within days of moving in, he and his assistant Gerard Malanga were hard at work handcrafting 400 wooden sculptures, made to look as much as possible like ordinary grocery boxes.
You can look back at photographs of the studio when he's making the box sculptures in February and March of '64, only a month after he's been in the studio. And the box sculptures are laid out on the floor of the studio, lined up, box by box, on brown paper, being painted by hand and then silkscreened one at a time, and it looks just like an assembly line, looks like a factory. In fact, it's the first time where you really get a sense that what's still basically, of course, a cottage industry is being accelerated. The momentum's increasing, the quantity is increasing. It becomes much more like a factory. Between '64 and '68, he produces 3 times as many works as he does between '61 and '63, but his sense of the momentum is constant. Maybe it's just the quantities that are shifting. So many of the breakthroughs of what we think of as the breakthroughs are going on constantly.
That spring, as the first box sculptures rolled off the assembly line at the factory, dramatic proof came that his paintings had lost none of their power to create shock and outrage. Asked to create a giant mural for the New York State Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair, he settled on a series of criminal mugshots drawn from the files of the FBI. The giant 20 by 20 foot multi-paneled silkscreen, called The 13 Most Wanted Men, had just gone up when on April 16, 1964, a week before the fair was to open, the architect Philip Johnson called to inform him that Governor Nelson Rockefeller himself had deemed the piece offensive and insisted it be replaced within 24 hours. When Warhol suggested replacing the mugshots with a giant image of the fair's president, Robert Moses, Johnson angrily dismissed the notion. In the end, Warhol had the mural painted over in silver. "That'll be my art," he said. Six days later, on April 21, 1964, Warhol's grocery boxes went on display for the first time. A huge crowd of curious onlookers lined up around the block, eager to see the show. You could barely get in, Robert Indiana recalled. It was like going through a maze.
Andy, a Canadian government spokesman said that your art could not be described as original sculpture. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Why do you agree?
Well, because it's not original.
You have just then copied a common item.
Yes.
Well, why have you bothered to do that? Why not create something new?
Because it's easier to do.
Well, isn't this sort of a joke, then, that you're playing on the public?
No. It gives me something to do.
That night, Warhol threw open the doors of the factory for the first time and let the world in. With rock music blasting from multiple speakers and the dazzling glare of the red, white, and green spotlights Billy Linick had hung, glancing hypnotically off the silver walls, the loud and raucous event, the first of many that would help define the cultural ferment of the next half-decade, would be remembered by many people in attendance as the night the 60s began.
That's probably the first of the famous all tomorrow's parties at the factory. It really launches the factory as a different kind of space. Again, quintessentially 60s. High and low, high society, uptown, downtown, rough types, polished types. It mixed like carnival. Everything came together.
The soapbox show and the opening of the factory marked a crucial turning point in Warhol's career. If the crush of people at the Sable Gallery were proof that his fame was continuing to rise, many old friends were baffled by the sea change his personality had undergone in little more than half a year. Many more were baffled by the box sculptures themselves, and in the aftermath of the show, even longtime supporters like Ethel and Robert Scull began to back away, canceling their order of Brillo boxes. Warhol himself, though deeply wounded, refused to linger over the setback, taking instead the advice he would often give to other artists in the years to come. "Don't think about making art," he said. "Just get it done. Let everyone else decide whether it's good or bad, whether they love it or hate it. While they're deciding, make even more art." By then, Warhol had long since begun to take his own advice, moving in new directions and plunging into the artistic possibilities of an entirely new medium, which for the next 5 years would form the central focus of his artistic output, and which he would use to create some of the most radical and challenging artworks of the 20th century.
I remember coming to New York in the early 60s, and he said, "Irving, I've made a movie." And I said, "Really?" I said, "What's it about?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you. You have to see it." I said, "Okay." And he took me into a little viewing room, and he sat me down and left the room, and the image came on, and it was called Kiss. It wasn't titled, but it was about two people kissing, lips touching, and no movement. And no movement, and no movement. And I said to myself, I remember distinctly saying to myself, it's a slide. And he's testing me for one reason or another. But I was determined to sit, and I sat and watched, and no movement, and no movement, and then the man blinked. And it was like a revelation. So, along with everything else, Andy was doing nothing less than reinventing cinema from the beginning and taking you through the whole process on his terms. How's that for a challenge? I think the movies are extraordinary, by the way, and I think they represent a really rich body of his activity.
The other way of thinking about the factory is the film factory, the dream factory. This is where Warhol is making his films. He's been making films since 6 months before, since the summer of '63. And it's quite clear that even before he's making films, he's thinking about making film. And there are techniques and structures in his early paintings of the '60s that are very cinematic and have a relationship to film.
The serious critics agree now that is where he finally had to go. He could not say what he wanted to say in sculpture and painting or sketches. He had to move to film, and that's the definitive work.
I think that there was an easy transition from being a person, a graphic artist who worked in a still medium to be hung on a wall, to the very early films, Eat, Sleep, things of that sort. And it was particularly so for the Andy Warhol who went around saying, "Oh, it's so beautiful," and focusing on things that no one would notice. Maybe Chardin would have noticed somebody eating a mushroom and done a great painting. But most of us think, what the hell are we talking about? Someone's eating a mushroom, big deal. But to just turn a camera on that person and watch while that happens, actually just take it all in, was enough for Andy. And it was a visually very interesting thing to do.
As for what makes it art, is because it is a serious examination of the nature of existence. And those early films were very serious, the silent ones. If you say that art, sculpture, and painting studies the instantaneous, right? Space and the instantaneous in human experience, film is brought in to study the time dimension that men live in. Film will deal with that which reveals itself through time.
So Andy's first films were handheld camera. He went out and got a tripod, put the Bolex on a tripod, and basically said, I'm going to see what the camera does without interfering with it. So he would do the 3-minute rolls, the 16mm black and white Tri-X portrait thing.
He said, I want to make a movie, so I will. I don't know how to make a movie, but I'll just make it. I'll film a guy sleeping. And, you know, it turned out to be totally brilliant.
He made his first film in the summer of 1963, shooting hour after hour of his friend and sometimes lover John Giorno, as he slept in the second-floor bedroom of his apartment on East 74th Street.
I've very often been struck with the fact that how rarely we are actually in a position to see the way a painter might see in a sustained way. For example, how rarely you get a chance to look at someone's face as a portraitist might look at a face for a minute or 2 or 3 or 4 without an exchange happening. And he did that in film. And then, I think, with the first of his masterpieces among film, which is Sleep, he came up with a fascinating idea, which is what these films offer that paintings don't is literal clock time. There's no cutting, there's no jumping around in time, it just goes straight through. To look at someone asleep, which is in itself a very interesting and involving experience. How many people have looked at their children asleep and been completely absorbed in it? Found it a very fascinating and deep experience. Here is this person asleep, the poet John Giorno. And the camera looks at this in literal clock time. And what is it looking at? It is looking at the time in the day for all of us when literal clock time disappears. And we go into another kind of time, sleep time, dream time, in which hours and minutes are mixed up together. Now, that is what I call a stroke of genius. To stare at that hour after hour and know that what's going on is literal time disappearing inside the sleeper's mind is fascinating. Now, how many people want to sit and watch all 8 hours, or is it 6 hours of sleep? I cannot say. It won't be millions, I'll tell you. But nonetheless, it's an idea that is fascinating and brilliant.
I saw the show and the tension was just tremendous. It kept building up. It was
really?
a huge crescendo.
Oh.
People couldn't be still.
Was the screen nice? And I mean, is the movie house nice?
The movie house was nice. It was a large screen. The image was very large.
Oh.
About 12, 20 feet high.
Really? Oh.
And at one point, about 45 minutes after it began, some guy ran down from the audience, ran up to the screen, up the stage, and the ear was showing then.
Yeah.
And like yelled in the ear, "Wake up!"
In all the early silent films of the period, Warhol insisted upon one basic departure from reality. Shot at the standard sound speed of 24 frames per second, the films were always projected at the slower silent speed of 16 frames per second. That minimal transformation, the filmmaker Jonas Mekas observed, was the mark of Warhol's genius. The one little choice that shifts the whole to a totally new angle, celebrating existence by slowing down our perceptions.
What stayed with me, I think, is a sense that gradually developed as I looked at his movies and at his paintings of a different relation to time. It's hard to explain, and it sounds abstract, but it's a physical experience that I have in front of Warhol's work. It's an experience of time altering. And I began to intuit that this was Warhol's experience of the world that he was reproducing in his artwork and allowing us to have access to.
But he was fascinated by anything in this world. You know, as he said himself, just the way the light is caught in a person's eyes and slightly moves. So he was able to watch for many, many hours nearly still objects.
When he decides to do the Empire State Building had just prior to that been lit up for the first time. And, you know, in some ways he saw the Empire State Building as a star. So right away, he's able to take this building, which is iconic. I mean, it's fantastic, right? It's lit up. He places it dead center in his screen. And then what does he do? He does the opposite of what you would think good movie making is about. He places this stationary camera and walks away. I mean, then there's the famous strobe cuts, the end of the reel, and making that bright light. He makes it all visible. So instead of hiding those things, he uses those things. He makes them part of the art. And so in that sense, I think it's consistent with all the other work. He really reduces it to its basic elemental levels: time, subject matter, film, light. And in the process of reducing it, he opens something up completely different.
So he launched a series of living portraits. They're mistakenly called screen tests. They're not screen tests, because no one is being tested for any movie. They are living portraits, and they're 3 minutes each of the person. And there's over 400 of them, perhaps 472, something like that, of these 3-minute breathing, living portraits, I call them.
Anyone who came to the factory could have their screen test to be in the films. And it was just 3 minutes sitting in front of the camera where Andy would load the film in, focus it, set the frame, turn it on, and walk away. And you were sitting there, it was up to you what you did. Usually people just sat still for like 3 minutes.
The screen tests, Gerard Malanga recalled, were studies in subtle sadism. The camera was located relentlessly 15 feet away. The recorded results were often brutal. "I looked like a refugee from the Menninger Clinic," the actress Sally Kirkland said after seeing herself on screen. "You sit staring at the camera, and after a while, your face starts to disintegrate."
I think they're riveting. You know, Empire, Sleep, screen tests. The early ones that Gerard Malanga, I think, calls stillies rather than movies, because they're usually of still imagery or haircut, barely moving things. They're riveting because, first of all, they have a lot of nude flesh in them, or a lot of sexual implications, so that they were incredibly tantalizing. You know, like one, which is, I think, his greatest film in many ways. You're looking for, I think it's 35 minutes, maybe it's 40, at this guy's face, and something is going on. You as viewer are both part of what's going on and not part of it. You know, it's like being God in a way. You're getting to spy on someone alone in his room. And there's just unparalleled voyeuristic delight getting to stare at somebody. There's also a kind of archival joy of, oh my God, here's 35 minutes of real 1963 time that's unnarrated, unmediated by the opinions of the moment. It's just naked time that I'm getting to look at.
So that first phase was like a brilliant set of consideration on the nature of literal time for the graphic eye, culminating in Sleep, in my opinion. Then he reached the point where he started looking around saying, what am I going to do next? And he thought, well, here are all these people that are around me. Obviously, they should be in the movies. I should make them part of the movies. So there's a transitional film, or what I regard as a transitional film, called Haircut. And Haircut consists of simply a person set down on a chair and a sheet put around there, and then they do a haircut. And it lasts the duration of the film.
The haircut one is very powerful because it's an examination of power, right? Power and submission. So it's really an essay on really sexual dominance and sexual submission, emphasized by the person also just sitting and watching, just sitting there, often looking at the camera, because then you have this strange thing of you're watching somebody watching, right? You realize when it's over that you've learned an awful lot about how people submit and how people dominate, the power of the person with the scissors. And always that mysterious and never-ending source of ideas. The third person just sitting and looking at the camera. See, the point is to make you always aware that you're watching a movie, to stop that Hollywood thing that goes on, where you're sucked into it and believe it's true. The Warhol films never allow you to do that. To stop for 1 minute thinking that you're looking at a film. To stop that is to make the audience aware that there is no one watching this person except themselves. So you become aware of yourself all the time as perceiver.
I think that there is in Andy a very powerful drive to look, not touch, to see and not connect. He retains his passivity. He is the opposite of a director. He's the anti-director. He is not trying to create his vision, not trying to make it happen on the screen. He's trying to let it happen on the screen. And that involves him withdrawing from actual direction altogether into a pure visuality, or purer visuality, the kind of a look but don't touch distance, which is also very near, which for most people doesn't happen very often. That voyeurism, which I'm sure was part of his psychology, a deep part of his psychology, drove him always. That is, for Andy, the notion of eros, of sexuality, also was, I suspect, a lot of look but don't touch. He was someone who intensely disliked being touched. So he wanted to create a distancing space around himself, which was the only way he could be close, safely close. And I think that that worked beautifully in the early films, because it is exactly what they do too.
Andy didn't want to be the one in front of the camera. Andy wanted to be behind the camera. He wanted to record other people's bodies as stand-ins for his own. And so, absolutely, the axiom of Andy Warhol is that every beauty, every image is Andy. And that Andy did not make images of ugliness. Everything is a face. Everything is a beautiful face. Even if it's urine stains or a Coke bottle, it's in some level a human face, as beautiful, as desirable.
Andy became famous by making other people famous. You know, I mean, we're talking Mr. Passive Aggressive here. We're talking passive aggression at the level of genius. He made people famous, and then he became famous for making people famous. Andy didn't really ever present himself as a star. He presented himself as a star maker. But, I mean, but how shrewd. He created a factory, made himself the boss. He wouldn't pay anything into anybody. It was supposed to be fun. And what was the fun is that, you know, if whatever kind of sex you wanted was available there, whatever kind of drugs you wanted was available there. So, in a sense, he was sort of fueling his own career, you know, with the darker impulses of the people that came in there.
Of all the figures pressed into service over the next 5 years, as Andy Warhol's on-screen surrogates or stand-ins, none would play a more crucial role in the complex and increasingly volatile atmosphere of the factory than the succession of on-screen alter egos he called superstars. Troubled souls, for the most part, drawn from the retinue of rebellious socialites, aspiring actresses, fashion models, and drag queens, pulled into the orbit of the factory by his growing notoriety.
And he had just bought the Oricon Sync Sound 16mm camera because he wanted to go into sound, because at that point, silent films would no longer say what he had to. But he felt that silent films now were a block of work that said what he could with silent film. And now he wanted to go into sound, the next step up. And he wasn't sure what he was going to do.
From there, it was a very short step to suddenly saying to the factory freaks, do something on the screen. Not just sit there, do something. Don't just sleep, don't just eat, don't just hold still, but do something. And to do something, you have to give them a suggestion. And this is where Ronnie Tavel came in. And he said, all right, I will give these crazies something to do. I will write scripts for them, and they will perform it on camera. And he got Andy, and he proceeded to make the films of the second phase happen and possible.
The new superstars Warhol's sound films would create were real, one man later said. not hidden behind the protective veneer of acting out a character created by someone else.
There were a few people used who were trained actors. So you basically get non-professionals, who are interesting to look at and who will reveal themselves in some way. Non-actors can be even more interesting than professionals, because now we'll have the real person. The screen can capture the real person and directly revealing human nature rather than through a character.
I mean, at one level, it was like a Judy Garland movie. Hey, let's all do a show. You know what I mean? But it was like the X-rated version of a Judy Garland movie. Hey, I'll make the sets. We'll just go naked. We won't wear costumes. I mean, it was like, it had that aspect to it, and it was fueled by amphetamines, which again makes one probably more verbal than one would normally be, and fueled by the anxiety of sort of sexual confusion.
I think that the people who gathered around Andy in the factory looked at him and said, here is this scared, shy, poor, miserable, talented, interesting guy who's made himself one of the most famous people in the world. And he is going to do the same for me. We'll all be redeemed. I am not the miserable, scared loser that I felt like most of my life. I'm actually gonna be a star. I'm going to have it happen because this guy has figured out how to make it happen for people like me. He's figured out how to do it. He has the magic touch.
The people I loved were the ones like Freddie Herco, the leftovers of show business, turned down at auditions all over town. They couldn't do something more than once, but their once was better than anyone else's. They had star quality, but no star ego. They didn't know how to push themselves. They were too gifted to lead regular lives, but they were also too unsure of themselves to ever become real professionals.
By the summer of 1964, Warhol had become an orchestra conductor of extreme possibilities, Jonas Mekas declared, and the impresario of 20 or so sad, frustrated, unfulfilled, outcast, egocentric underground stars on the brink of waiting to be used. Andy was like the Marquis de Sade, Emile de Antonio observed, in that his very presence acted as a kind of release for people, so they could live out their fantasies, get undressed, or in some cases do very violent things to get Andy to watch them. He was able to bring that out in a lot of people, doing weird things in his early films who wouldn't have done what they were doing for money or D.W. Griffiths or anybody else.
And Andy is making them the center of things, and there's a kind of social inversion that's going on. But somehow out of that, Andy was able to generate a lot of product. I mean, the appeal of it was so shrewd. You know, you've got all these nice, cute, face-lifted society ladies in there, and all of these drag queens, and all of these hustlers, and musicians, and it was so attractive. And whenever anybody came to town, they'd always have to go there. You know, and he created this kind of Grand Central Station. You know, it's kind of dystopian Grand Central Station. A lot of people died, you know, and a lot of people had their hearts broken forever and ever. And, I mean, you know, you cannot construe it as being nice, but it was really a rough democracy, you know.
In October 1964, the factory registered its first casualty when Freddie Herco, convinced he could fly, danced out of an apartment window, high on speed, and plunged to his death.
He was just dancing and danced right out the window on Cornelia Street and died. And he said, gee, isn't it too bad we weren't there to shoot it? I turned frigid when I couldn't believe somebody would say this, and people have criticized me and said, well, didn't you understand he's speaking about the aesthetics of somebody dancing out the window and killing themselves? And I think I have a right to say, no, wait a minute. There is a line that you don't go beyond, and this man does not know that line.
I don't think he was really a bad person. I think he did some awfully bad things, you know. I think like anyone, when Andy suddenly found that he had acquired the stardom that he was mimicking, which is what he was doing, it is hard to undergo that moment in which you find that you can make people do things and you're kind of drunk with your own power. And I think there really was a period in the 60s in which Andy indulged himself. But, I mean, you talk to his brothers, you talk to anybody, most people loved him. Most of the people that worked the factory loved him. I mean, there are people who hate Andy, and quite a few of them, but not many people whom I have met who knew him disliked him. A lot of them disliked his parsimony and his manipulativeness. But he was genuinely, you know, a river under his people, you know. I mean, he had a lot more to give than he took.
If somebody wants to be in movies, you can buy their life and say, we'll do 2 movies of your life for that year, or 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how interesting that person is. If their life is interesting enough, they can go on forever.
In '65 at the Silver Factory, the tempo took a change when Edie Sedgwick came in from Boston with her Harvard clique and to be the new girl of the year. Jane Holzer was really the first girl of the year, and she got coverage about that. But Edie came in at like this angel out of a cloud of blue, just with the lightning strikes around her. She was so poised, such a director and actress at the same time. She had this poise of complete composure, and when she walked into a room, everyone was on point.
I think it's sheer beauty. She had sort of a gamine look, very long legs, very pale face, very pale lips, and a waif in a way. Time sort of stopped when you were with her. I think she may have been the very first of the great superstars. And she came to New York, and Andy Warhol took a look at her at this Lester Persky party, fell in love with her.
Of all the superstars drawn into the orbit of Andy Warhol's career, none would match the brilliance with which Edie Sedgwick blazed across the firmament of the factory in 1965. From the very start, the ravishingly beautiful, deeply troubled 22-year-old heiress held a special fascination for Warhol, with her pale good looks, aristocratic pedigree, and restless, drop-dead charm. With a deeply addictive personality and family shadows that included a predatory father and 2 brothers who had killed themselves less than 10 months apart the year before, Sedgwick had more problems than anyone I had ever met, Warhol said. Gerard Malanga called her the personification of the poor little rich girl.
She was an enchanting creature. I helped do a book on her, really to find out why, at the age of 28, she died. The girl with everything on her way, this amazing beauty, very gifted in a funny way, an artist, could have been a good actress, I think. But then she got tied up with Warhol, and of course for Warhol it was a great thing to have this creature to take around. She sort of became at his side all the time. They went to parties together.
What happened when he met Edie Sedgwick was that he saw her as his ticket to Hollywood. That was very clear. And he wanted me to write scripts that more and more were Hollywood films to show off her talent so he would be bought by Hollywood and make Hollywood movies. His only dream that he was never to fulfill.
Oh, wow. Great.
Their first film effort together, a 1-character piece starring Edie as herself, was called Poor Little Rich Girl.
Most beautiful coat in the room.
Though half the film was out of focus, Edie's charisma shone through anyway, and her career as an underground film star was launched. For their next project, Warhol asked Tavel to write a new script for Edie. Something in a kitchen, he said. Something white and clean and plastic. The result was Kitchen. In the film, Edie and her mostly male co-stars drift around the pristine kitchen of a studio apartment, chattering all but inaudibly, thanks to the poor quality of the sound. It ends when one of her co-stars, for no apparent reason, strangles her on the kitchen table, while the rest of the party look on. In what would prove to be in many ways her best film, Beauty Number 2, Cedric could be seen sprawling nearly naked on a bed with a handsome young man, while from the darkness off camera, an unseen man lays siege to her with a series of increasingly personal and hostile questions.
What do you mean? Say that again. What do you keep asking me what I mean for? You know damn well what I mean.
I don't know what you mean. What do you mean? Why would I say, what do you mean, if I knew what you mean?
And it was electric. And the extraordinary thing about the film was that there was the third actor, this sort of voyeur figure, very much in a way like Andy, you know, the voyeur watching these two beautiful people on this bed, this boy and this girl. And she was very much drawn by him, but also drawn by these terrifying questions being put to her by the man in the foreground, Chuck Wine his name was. And they were very personal questions.
How does that sound, Edie? I'll wake you up tomorrow. We'll find another doctor. You can read. I've got
Beauty Number 2, in many ways, was the high point of Edie Sedgwick's career. By the time it premiered on July 17, 1965, to glowing reviews that certified her status as the queen of underground film in New York, her relationship with Warhol had already begun to sour. She often talked about trying to get close to Andy, a mutual friend reported, but she never could get close to him on an emotional level. Money, too, became an issue. Though the films seldom made a profit and had to be subsidized by the sale of Warhol's paintings, Edie grew increasingly resentful of his refusal to pay her for her work. Egged on by her friends, including Bob Dylan's right-hand man, Bobby Newworth, with whom she would soon start a passionate affair. It was the beginning of a bitter tug-of-war between the Warhol and Dylan camps, which was still going on the day Dylan himself sat for 2 tense screen tests at the factory 6 months later. By then, Edie herself had started the long spiral down into darkness and drug abuse that would end with her death 5 years later.
By the time I came along, she had come back from Woodstock a heroin addict, and there wasn't much you could do with her.
And I think Andy knew that too, and that it was the beginning of the end. Many dreams were dying for him, that he'd keep trying with her, but he knew she wasn't going to take him to Hollywood. And in fact, every day she was heavier and heavier into drugs, so she couldn't, aside from not making Lauren's work, couldn't remember anything anymore.
When Edie Sedgwick started going into the outer darkness, Andy Warhol did not try and bring her back. Or if he did, it was a pretty ineffective gesture. So that's a factor that one must weigh along with the greatness and the brilliance and the talent and all the rest. His, I have to say it, his responsibility to these people who came into his world. Edie Sedgwick, because she came from a socially prominent family, ended up not dying in the streets exactly, but dying terribly at the age of 28. 28. That's just the beginning of life for most people. She looked like this bedraggled, wretched has-been at the age of 28. It was horrifying. It was sickening what happened. It was sickening what happened to a large number of people who were wrapped up in that dream.
Even as the chaos of the factory intensified, Warhol's creative energies continued to soar upward. In the fall of 1965, he announced he was leaving painting behind entirely to focus on a new series of projects involving music, dance, performance art, and film, and a rock and roll group he had recently been introduced to called the Velvet Underground. On October 4th, to mark his farewell to painting, he released the first in a series of helium-filled silver balloons from the roof of the factory and watched them float away into the ether above Midtown Manhattan.
Oh, it's beautiful. It really is. Oh, it's infinite because it goes in with the sky. Oh, it is fantastic. This is one of the most exciting things that's ever happened.
It was the beginning of what would prove to be the most creative, chaotic, and fateful period of his entire career.
We went from Edie Sedgwick to multimedia happenings, you know, and the Exploding Plastic Inevitable. We had just hooked up with the Velvet Underground, and Andy was starting to promote them and sponsor them, and we had this great idea of doing a multimedia show. Instead of just simple films, we would have the Velvet Underground performing on stage. We will have, before that, shot a film of the Velvet Underground and Nico, which we did at the factory. And while they're performing on stage at the Cinematheque, we'll project the film on them and the background and have multiple films going. And then we progressed to more where we started using strobe light explosions, and then Paul brought in the plop, plop, plop doodle projection thing, you know, the scrambled eggs or whatever it was. And we eventually ended up at the Dome with the Exploding Plastic Inevitable.
On Friday, April 8, 1966, Warhol's multimedia happening, The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, opened at the Dome, a one-time Polish community center on St. Mark's Place. By 8 p.m., a crowd of nearly 1,000 had gathered in the garishly lit main ballroom. On stage, as strobe lights flashed blindingly, Lou Reed and John Cale of the Velvet Underground blasted away at top volume, while Nico stood in front, a strange Norse goddess, singing in her ethereal voice. Gerard Malenta, studded in leather armbands, lifted dumbbells and cracked a long whip, and using a ballpoint pen, pretended to inject himself with heroin. Ondine and Bridget Polk, meanwhile, moved through the crowd, giving friends and acquaintances real injections of amphetamines through their clothes. Above it all was Warhol himself, standing on the balcony, projecting silent films on a whitewashed wall behind the band, using light filters and slide projectors to throw ever-shifting colors and shapes on the walls of the hall's interior. Watching him, the filmmaker Jonas Mekas saw a kind of mystical impresario, or sorcerer, structuring with temperaments, egos, and personalities, who maneuvered it all into sound, image, and light symphonies of tremendous emotional and mental pitch. Somewhere in the shadow, totally unnoticeable, but following every second and every detail of it. We all knew something revolutionary was happening, Warhol himself declared. We just felt it. Things couldn't look this strange and new without some barrier being broken.
What he succeeded in doing most of all, and probably the hardest thing to do, is to encapsulate a moment. And he did that. When you think of the 60s, when you think of how varied that time was, and when you think of, say, for example, this country prior to that time, I mean, music was ding, ding, ding goes the trolley, as I recall. You know, I mean, everything changed. Everything changed. And Andy, absolutely in the center, watching it, recording it, adding whatever he was able to add, one insight after another. I think, to this day, remarkable.
We were in the back room of Max's Kansas City, where he always held court, right? And he waited for the whole crowd to leave the table and go off and dance or fool around. And then he just picked up a napkin and he drew a line in the middle of it, dividing it in half, and wrote B on one side and white on the other. And he said, I want to make a movie that is a long movie, that is all black on one side and all white on the other. And do you understand? And I said, yes, right. that was to become Chelsea Girls. I saw right away that something like Kitchen and Shower, these are white films, and Edie is white, and so with vinyl, certain of the screen test things, these are black movies, right, the sadomasochistic ones, and that they would be juxtaposed on a double screen using 2 projectors.
Shooting on the film's 12 unrelated scenes began in June 1966 and went on for nearly 4 months in the dimly lit interiors of a rundown retreat on West 23rd Street called the Chelsea Hotel. Warhol completing an average of 1 33-minute sound reel a week, some in color, some in black and white, with nothing for the factory regulars to go on, beyond the few sketchy scenes Tavel had provided.
You filthy horror! How dare you! How dare you! I'm a phony? Well, so are you. So are you, admit it! Stop it! Admit it, you! Admit you're phony, you creep! Hands off me! My hands are off you for all time, you lousy creep! Get your hands off me.
In the end, Warhol and Morrissey assembled the 12 most striking scenes they had shot into a single 6.5-hour-long sequence, then cut the running time in half by projecting 2 reels at a time, side by side, one in color, the other in black and white.
I'm sorry, but that's a autistic bore. Little Miss Phony. I hit you with my festered hand, you dumb bitch.
Chelsea Girls is, I think, plainly the most brilliant and successful and artistically important of all the films, without any doubt, because it is a really successful synthesis of the 2 aspects of Andy's genius. One, what was happening with these crazy people, and a way of integrating it not into narrative, for which he had no gift at all, but into his graphic genius. And that is the dual screen and the projectionist as a kind of orchestra director. I think that was a genuinely dazzling idea. Visually dazzling, artistically dazzling, and a wonderful way of incorporating all of these people into a coherent work, built exclusively upon what Andy did like no one else could do, which was arrange the visual scene. And that, therefore, it makes it his best film. The idea of having the camera be witness to the weirdness of his characters, of these people, worked there as it never worked again as well, and never worked before as well. It's a genuine achievement, and I think it will be a lasting contribution to the whole history of film.
December 11th, 1966. It has come time to wag the warning finger at Andy Warhol and his underground friends and tell them politely but firmly they are pushing a reckless thing too far. It is time for permissive adults to stop winking at their too precocious pranks. It is particularly important to put a stout spoke in Mr. Warhol's wheel. Bosley Crowther, The New York Times.
As 1967 began, Warhol began handing out a simple piece of advice to anyone who asked. Do everything, he said. The success of the previous year, culminating in the Dom concerts and Chelsea Girls, had enlarged his ambitions still more. I felt so good about things, like we could do everything, he later recalled. I wanted to have a movie playing at Radio City, a show on at the Winter Garden, the cover of Life, a book on the bestseller list, a record on the charts. And it all seemed feasible for the first time.
And in the mid-60s, at the factory, we were steering American culture in the popular arts sense. And the feeling of that was there. We could feel the power. We knew exactly we were at the pinnacle of this great wave. And we were so it.
He was so popular that I remember on one occasion he got a double to be him. Amazing story. He got this fella, somebody, I think he, at the factory one day, somebody said, Andy Warhol's got a speaking engagement out in Wisconsin. Would you like to be Andy Warhol? So this fellow went out to Wisconsin, got a sort of a makeup on so he looked vaguely like Warhol, and got away with it until he went out to some place when the airplane landed. There was a windstorm or something, and blew up all his makeup and his hair. So he was found out. And then, of course, he got into the papers, you know, got into Newsweek and Time. Andy Warhol's fake, his doppelganger.
But it couldn't go on. The dream of this great good place that will always be good, everything will be great. All these drugs and all these beautiful, strange, weird people and all the ways in which the incompetence of these talented people was forgiven. It was all fine to be just who you are, the wreck that you are, you know. All of that got challenged when, sooner or later, one of them had to be destructive. I mean, really destructive.
Whatever comes along. Like somebody called up yesterday, a girl, and she said, I have a script called Up Your Ass. And I thought the title was so great, and I was so friendly, I just told her to come up. But she still, you know.
Andy was vulnerable. He didn't have defenses. Like I said, the factory was always open to anyone who came in and wanted to play with us and become a part of us, and if they could, they could. You know, we didn't have any stipulations, you got to be this or do that. They came in and they fit, and, you know, Valerie Solanas was one of them who found her way there.
As his reputation grew, an increasing number of strangers began showing up at the factory, along with an increasing number of unsolicited manuscripts. So many, in fact, that almost no one took notice one morning in early 1967, when a new play by an unknown writer turned up in the incoming pile of mail. An incendiary diatribe called Up Your Ass. It was the work of a deeply troubled 30-year-old writer named Valerie Solanas, who, forced to scratch out a living turning tricks in the East Village, had recently embarked on a campaign against the entire male sex, writing a blistering anti-male manifesto, and founding a group called Scum, the Society for Cutting Up Men, whose only member was herself.
She was an angry person, and she had to turn tricks, you know. And I think it's one of the reasons she came to hate men even more. And she had to go through that whole period of street living, selling herself just to be able to get a place to stay.
At their first meeting, he told her that her work was so obscene, he had initially feared she was an undercover policeman, trying to entrap him. Sure, I'm a cop, Solanas replied, pulling down the zipper of her pants. Here's my badge.
It was very simple. Valerie wanted to be a great writer, and she had written a play, an absolutely unproducible, insane play. And Andy read the play, or someone around him read the play, and either he or someone around him said, oh, this is good, Valerie, we'll do a movie of it sometime.
And he kept promising her that, oh, I'll get it to the right people, or I'll make it into a movie. He hated to say no, Andy, and that sometimes got him in trouble because she was counting on him and her insanity to actually make this into a movie, and it was this ultra man-hating manifesto. And he just put it in a drawer, and I don't even know if he showed it to anybody.
They were never going to do a movie of it. And at a certain point, Valerie figured it out, that it wasn't ever going to happen. And she was someone who could not handle that challenge to that fantasy. She simply couldn't live with it.
As the summer of 1967, the summer of love, turned to fall, a new mood began to spread across the country. As the war in Vietnam dragged on, once peaceful protests began to give way to angry demonstrations and confrontations with the police. Increasingly now, racial unrest exploded into violence on the streets of major cities, where every sign of urban decay, from drug use to white flight, was on the rise.
When you walk in the factory, there was a sense of peril, with Undine shooting up down in the back, with Rona having a tantrum, or Irene Nicholson clawing Andy, saying, "You have to marry me. You have to," you know, all these crazy people. And Henry Geldzahler stopped coming over after a while, and Jane did too, because it was a little disturbing for her, because she needed attention, you know. And with Undine and Bridget around, those monsters would just, with their tongue, tear people apart.
You're dealing with people that are unstable to begin with, and then you provide a situation in which they use very dangerous drugs and hallucinogens, or even amphetamines, which are going to drive people over the edge.
Lou Reed actually said something. Lou said, you know, so there come a point in that world where if you don't want to die, you've got to be hip enough to be square. And there are a lot of dead people that weren't hip enough to be square.
The year before, another factory regular, Danny Williams, had left a pile of clothes on the beach and disappeared into the sea. And with each passing month now, the psychic toll of the factory seemed to be on the rise, exacerbated by drug use, angry infighting amongst the regulars, and rising anger at Warhol himself.
I think you're right. I mean, I think everyone that was close to Andy ended up having very ambivalent feelings. It almost always developed into a love-hate thing. Because, you know, you started off feeling inspired by Andy and ended up feeling used. Because he really sucked you dry.
More and more, behind Warhol's back, factory regulars took to using the nickname Undine had coined for him. Drella, a contraction of Cinderella and Dracula. At once the ragged stepsister who transforms herself into a princess, and the bloodthirsty vampire who sucks people's blood.
There's a moment of revulsion. There really is. And I can understand that. When you're writing about somebody as strong and as troubling and as powerful as Andy was, as a writer, at a certain point, you wake up one morning and you go to the desk and you say, I hate this son of a bitch. This is a really disgusting human being. I went through real revulsion. Now, I don't feel that still, but I went through a phase of it. And I can tell you what disturbs me, which is you watch people around you that you've made promises to and who are there because they are thrilled to be around you. And they are killing themselves, and you don't do a damn thing about it. Nothing. Maybe you can say, I can't save them, but you try. You think about trying. I don't think that Andy did. I think it was a price of his passivity that he didn't really try.
As the mood in the factory turned increasingly uneasy, Warhol began getting angry phone calls from Valerie Solanas, enraged he had not made moves to produce or film her play, and insisting he return the manuscript she had sent.
And so she now started calling about, I want my script, I'm going to come over and get my script, and we couldn't find it. So in her paranoid psychosis, anger thing, she decided that we actually tricked her into leaving the script, and we're saying we lost it until she forgot about it, and then we would use it for a film. You know, like we even cared about doing anything like that. But it would never have come about that we would have done her stuff, and she wasn't aggressive enough to make it happen.
When Warhol admitted misplacing the play, she demanded $25 to help pay her rent. He refused, then suggested she could earn the money by acting in one of his films, I, a Man, shot in August 1967, turning in what everyone agreed was an impressive performance. But her resentment only intensified. In October, she was evicted from the Chelsea Hotel for failure to pay back rent and took to the streets. Increasingly adrift now, she became obsessed with the idea that Warhol was conspiring with her publisher, Maurice Gerodius, to steal and exploit her work.
When Andy or someone around Andy said to someone like Valerie, who had felt miserable about being Valerie Solanas her whole life long, we're going to make your play. It's going to be a movie. She thought she had been told, again, we're going to make you a star. The light had shone on her. She was going to heaven too. All right? And when she figured out that it was a lie, she cracked. It was unbearable for her.
By early 1968, as the end of its lease approached, the disintegration of the silver factory was growing obvious. Increasingly now, Billy Name, who had carefully maintained the place for years, let the tinfoil peel off the walls. When the search began for a new space, Paul Morrissey chose the location himself, ignoring Billy's advice to rent a large, flexible open space, much like the original factory, settling instead on a series of offices on the 6th floor of 33 Union Square West. In early February 1968, the contents of the factory were moved to the new space, a brightly lighted suite with white walls and oak wood floors. No one was sure exactly what the future would hold, but it was obvious that the old factory, the legendary silver factory of the 1960s, was gone forever.
I can't tell you exactly when the change occurred, but my guess is late 60s, post the shooting, I think. You know, he was so accessible and so available, anybody could go to the studio until this madwoman nearly did him in. Valerie Solanas was her name, and she thought Andy was obliged to make her a movie star. Andy didn't feel that way. But that was her thinking, and as a result of his not coming across, she shot him.
I think that there was a way in which he had courted this problem in all his work from the depths of his being, and it came home. I don't think that it was possible for him ever really to say, I didn't do this. I think that he understood that, because he was a very smart guy, that in some ways he had let Valerie into his life, and by being Andy Warhol, he created for her a disappointment that she could not live with, literally could not live with. She had to do something. It was kill or be killed.
On the morning of June 3rd, 1968, Valerie Solanas resolved to put an end to the tormenting feelings that had been raging inside her for months. Dressed, despite the warmth of the late spring day, in a thick turtleneck sweater and heavy winter coat, and armed with 2 automatic pistols concealed beneath her outer garments in a brown paper bag, she went first to the Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street, looking for her publisher, Maurice Girodias. Girodias wasn't there, and after waiting in vain for nearly 3 hours, she headed east towards Union Square and the factory.
This is one of the tacky things that happened to Andy. He was even second choice to be assassinated. Girodias, her publisher, was the first thought she was going to get. She went over to the Chelsea Hotel with the gun, and he wasn't there. She waited all afternoon, and he didn't come in. Because the factory was relatively close, we're in Union Square. She said, Girodias, he isn't going to show up. Well, I'll go get Warhol.
She shot him because somebody else she wanted to shoot wasn't home. And when she finally realized he might not be there, she came, sat in front of the office to shoot Andy. She was going to shoot somebody that day.
Up in the factory, Paul Morrissey greeted her with casual contempt, brusquely telling her Warhol wasn't coming in. A lie, since he knew Warhol would be coming in later in the day, then curtly asked her to leave. Stymied again, Solanas headed back downstairs and waited on the street.
I was there at the office. It was a Friday, I think, and she kept coming up from 1 o'clock on, and she said, when's Andy coming? I said, he won't be in today. Come next week. And then she came back up 2 hours later. Where's Andy coming? I said, no, I told you he's away for the week. She came up 3 times.
She was still waiting on the street below when at 4:15 p.m., Warhol pulled up in a cab with his new assistant and boyfriend, Jed Johnson, in tow. Solanas chatted with the 2 men affably, then followed them into the elevator and rode with them up to the 6th floor, where Fred Hughes, Billy Name, and a sheepish Paul Morrissey greeted them as they spilled out onto the factory floor.
She had a raincoat on, and I said, now, Valerie, you caught me making up a lie. I'm sorry, but now I'm going to have to force you to leave because I can't have you here. I'm just teasing her. And she backed away from me, and suddenly her hands went into her pockets, and this thing came up, and I didn't understand what she had. And the phone rang. I went to the phone. It was Viva. was talking on the phone. I said, here, talk to Andy about something, and I left that section. I went to the back of the studio, and suddenly the shots rang out.
No one in the factory was paying much attention when Solanas quietly slipped a .32 automatic from beneath her coat, aimed it at her tormentor, and fired. The first shot went wide, and though everyone in the sixth-floor space heard the crack of gunfire, at first only Warhol himself clearly understood what was happening. No, no, Valerie, don't do it, he shouted, as she advanced towards him with the gun, shakily firing a second time, and again missing her mark.
She shot at Andy, and he was very sensible. He fell to the ground and actually hit his head on the corner of a desk, so he had a red mark here. And he laid on the ground as if he was shot. But she, being a little more crazy and clever, went up and put the gun up to his body.
As Warhol lay on the floor beneath a desk, Solanas deliberately approached to within a few feet, carefully took aim a third time, and fired again. The bullet this time ripping into his right side, just below the fourth rib, tearing a path through 7 major organs before exiting from his back. I felt a horrible, horrible pain, he said, as if a firecracker had exploded inside of me. As gouts of blood splattered from Warhol's horrific wounds, Solanas turned her attention to a visiting art critic named Mario Amaya and fired off 2 more shots at point-blank range, striking him in the hip. Scrambling to his feet, the stunned Englishman somehow managed to leap into a tiny office at the back of the factory before she could fire again.
We closed the door between the front and back, and I could see through the window what was happening, and she was going to shoot Fred. Fred said, "Don't shoot me, Valerie." She said, "I have to." It's so stupid.
As Solanas moved towards him with the gun, Hughes fell to his knees and pleaded with her to leave. She paused for a moment, turned away to call the elevator, then turned back, put the gun directly to Hughes' forehead, and prepared to pull the trigger. Before she could do so, the elevator door opened behind her, and Hughes, thinking swiftly, sternly commanded her to get in. "There's the elevator, Valerie," he said. "Just take it." For whatever reason, Solanas paused uncertainly for a moment, then obediently stepped into the empty car and fled, leaving behind a scene of bloody pandemonium.
I was in the dark room when I heard the shots, and when I got out, and up front, Andy was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, and people were like running around like chickens with their heads cut off, you know. So I went over and I picked him up in my arms, and he was still sort of conscious. And I was crying, and he said, "Oh, Billy, don't make me laugh. It hurts too much." You know, he was sort of getting delirious, like, too, you know, but he was still conscious in my arms then. But then he went out again, and I guess didn't come to until the hospital, and we didn't know if he was going to live or die. It was a real trauma because, from my point of view, someone I really loved was really hurt and was dying.
It took 23 minutes from the time of the shooting for the ambulance to arrive. When it did, the 2-man crew was unable to fit the stretcher into the cramped factory elevator and had to carry Warhol's profusely bleeding body down 6 flights of stairs to the street. Once in the ambulance, the dying artist lost consciousness completely, regaining it long enough in the emergency room at Columbus Hospital to hear one doctor say curtly to another, "No chance."
The doctors were standing over saying, "Well, this guy is DOA. We can't do anything for him." And Mario Amaya pops up, says, "You can't let him die. He's a famous artist and he's rich." So they brought in this Italian specialist, and only because Mario was there.
Not long after arriving at the hospital, Warhol's life functions ceased, and a minute and a half later, he was pronounced clinically dead. But the lead surgeon, Dr. Giuseppe Rossi, realizing who his famous patient was, refused to give up, and cutting open Warhol's chest, massaged his heart until it began to respond, then set to work on a staggeringly complex operation that would take more than 5 hours to complete.
And all of his vital organs were pierced except his heart, and he was operated on for 5 hours by 5 doctors. You know, one lung, the spleen, liver, kidneys, you name it, large intestines, small intestines. And afterwards they told Paul Morrissey and Fred Hughes and Jed Johnson, you know, he's probably not going to live. He's probably going to go into a state of shock when the anesthesia wears off. because of the trauma of the shooting, followed by the trauma of this multiple operations, and we'll probably lose him.
Well, we'd like to know, really, since he's still in a critical condition in that he's still being operated on, we'd like very much to know if his chances are improved now. It's a terribly shocking blow for us. He was a man we can only consider to be in the midst of life. You know, he's there around us all the time. We see him and we know him and we talk to him and we feel his presence. He has a kind of magic presence, and that's partly why this kind of circumstance could have occurred. People were attracted to him. He kind of magical presence about him, a kind of sweetness and light that emerged from his character in all its shyness. And he had this kind of glow about him, which made him tremendously appealing as a person.
Around 4 in the morning, Julia Warhol arrived at the hospital, looking drawn and grief-stricken. Then returned to the Lexington Avenue townhouse, where she spent long hours praying for her youngest son, imploring God to spare his life and let him marry Viva.
You worked with Andy quite a lot. Did you know this girl?
Yes, I met her once or twice.
How would you describe her?
Mixed up.
How do you feel now?
Not very well.
4 hours after the shooting, Valerie Solanas surrendered herself to a traffic policeman near Times Square, handing over her guns and saying simply, "He had too much control over my life." For days, Warhol lingered on the borderline of life and death, passing in and out of consciousness, uncertain most of the time what was going on around him. He was in a deep delirium 2 days after the shooting, when the television in his room brought bewildering news of Robert Kennedy's assassination in the kitchen of a Los Angeles luxury hotel. It was also strange to me, he later recalled, this background of another shooting and a funeral. I couldn't distinguish between life and death yet anyway. And here was a person being buried on the television, right in front of me.
I wasn't sure if I was back. I felt dead. I kept thinking, I'm really dead. This is what it's like to be dead. You think you're alive, but you're dead. I just think I'm lying here in a hospital.
Finally, on July 28, 1968, after nearly 2 months in the hospital, Warhol returned home, but even then remained housebound for weeks. In an eerie replay of his childhood, he spent hours sitting in bed, flipping through magazines, watching television, and talking on the phone. His scarred and shattered body, he told friends, looked like a Dior dress. But it's not that bad, he assured them. The scars look pretty in a funny way. It's just that they're a reminder that I'm still sick, and I don't know if I'll ever be well again.
I came to see that the event in Andy's life, apart from his discovery of who he was as an artist, which was very powerful when he hit it, the event was Valerie Solanas' attempt to murder him. The narrative was the rise to success. At the peak of that success, the breaking into it of horror, of someone who was crazy enough to wish him dead. And then the rest of his life, in some ways, facing down what he met that day. He had been told that while on the surgical table, his life functions had stopped briefly, and then they had been revived. He believed that he had died, and he had a fantasy, a theory, a belief about himself, which was that, as it were, at that moment, God decided to give him a second chance. He had died, but he took it back. And there was a deal that he could keep going for a while longer, but the deal could be rescinded at any time. And I think that he spent the rest of his life in some ways dealing with that fact.
On September 4th, Warhol appeared for the first time again in public at a party celebrating the completion of Midnight Cowboy, the John Schlesinger film that included in its climactic scene many regulars of the factory. Warhol spoke that evening with unusual candor to a reporter from the Village Voice.
Before I was shot, I always believed I was watching TV instead of living life. Right when I was being shot, I knew I was watching television. Since I was shot, everything is such a dream to me. I don't know whether or not I'm really alive, whether I died. It's sad. Life is a dream. I wasn't afraid before. And having died once, I shouldn't feel fear. But I'm afraid. I don't understand why. I'm afraid of God alone, and I wasn't before.
I'm here to tell you that Valerie turns Andy's life into a beautiful narrative of before and after. It's just the ghostly precision with which she cleaves his life into real Andy and posthumous Andy, any way you want to look at it. She makes vivid and actual all the scars that were already present, the holes, the punctures. Every issue in Andy's life and art, Valerie is an entrance to, and she's also a dramatic engine.
The great question after he'd been shot was there any way that he could continue to be Andy Warhol and fully move into a new phase? And that's a matter that has been greatly argued. He himself said many things indicating that he thought that in some ways it was over for him, that he was just imitating himself. But maybe that would be great too. Oh, it's so beautiful just to imitate yourself.
For nearly 18 months, Warhol himself seemed to be adrift, searching for a new direction, and to a large extent, failing to find one.
It's clearly traumatic. He can't work, he can't paint. In 1969, he starts painting again, but painting really doesn't begin to accelerate for a couple of years. His whole approach to the notion of the porousness of the studio changes too.
At the moment, what we seem to see reflected in that strange face is a sickness for which there may be no cure. Andy, in what one fervently hopes is just another put-on, begins to look more and more like the angel of death. Calvin Tompkins.
And then remarkably, little by little, he began to find his way, partly out of necessity, partly out of sheer instinct, as always following the current of the time, gathering himself and heading off into the new world of the 1970s, while most people were still reeling from the aftershocks of the 60s. In the years to come, with the help of a new entourage, he would reinvent himself once again, adapting and transforming the role he had taken on 20 years before, when he first came to New York, that of the commercial artist. Isn't life a series of images that change as they repeat themselves? He himself would later say, looking back.
I started as a commercial artist, and I wanted to finish as a business artist. During the hippie era, people put down the idea of business. They'd say money is bad, and working is bad. But making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art.
Really, Fred Hughes and Paul Morrissey together really turned Andy into a business. Fred turned the art business into a business, and Paul, made the movies into a business. And we were expected to keep fairly regular hours, not take drugs on the job. We saw this 60s factory as the enemy. They were the people we had to keep out, the drag queens and the speed freaks. Fred Hughes, Vincent Fremont, Pat Hackett, Jed Johnson, myself, Glenn O'Brien. We were kind of mostly from middle-class families. We had college education. And Andy would sometimes say, gee, you kids are so boring. I really miss those drag queens and speed freaks. They had so many more, they had ideas every minute. We'd say, well, if you want ideas every minute and you want to get shot again, fire us and bring them back.
For all the artistic ferment, the experiments of the 60s had never yielded much income. All that began to change in 1970, when Fred Hughes began to put into place a long-term strategy for increasing revenues and putting Warhol's artistic career on a solid business footing. He began by dipping into the unsold inventory of Warhol's pop paintings, taking advantage of the dramatic upturn in price that had occurred in the aftermath of the shooting. As the value of his work surged upward, Hughes urged Warhol to return to painting, not only to exploit the increasing interest in his pop art work, but to create silkscreen portraits of wealthy patrons. In return, lavish commissions Hughes would prove instrumental in securing. In the decade to come, Warhol's society portraits, often derided as artistic sellouts, would become the mainstay of the factory's rising financial fortunes and the centerpiece of an expanding business empire that would eventually push out in a dozen different directions.
The idea of it, it's a perfect model for sort of late 90s business. Horizontal, perpetual diversification. Today we're making a movie, tomorrow we're making a record, then we're starting a magazine, then we're doing this. The magazine supports the movie stars support the magazine, the portraits finance everything. And so basically Andy institutionalized himself.
In 1972, he put into motion his well-timed return to painting, beginning with a commissioned portrait calculated to reprise the shock of his early imagery. A silkscreen portrait of the leader of communist China, whose little red book, The Quotations of Chairman Mao, had become a minor bestseller that same year.
He worked with the famous image of Mao, which every Chinese school child had, and took that image and he defused it. So these paintings are fascinating for that, because here is this monster, but turned into this sort of effigy. And he was a fantastic colorist. And I think the Maos are particularly good in that respect. They've held up incredibly well. I think that the big ones are great, monumental, and have an overwhelming sense of scale. And the little ones are also very intense. They have extraordinary intensity.
By 1974, Warhol's commissioned portrait business was booming, charging $25,000 apiece for each original 40 by 40-inch canvas, with steep volume discounts if the client ordered multiple copies of the painting. He would bring in over $1 million in commissions that year alone.
They changed the face of portraiture. When you have this Polaroid with this hugely long lens, and you take a few Polaroids of you, and then, whatever it was, 2 or 3 weeks later, these magical images appear. They turn the sitter into a star. And I think that's what Andy liked doing. I think he said everybody could be a star for 5 minutes or whatever it was. And I think that's what those portraits are about, in a way.
Andy probably did 1,000 portraits, and there was a scheme to that, too, in his head. Andy always insisted that every portrait be 40 by 40 inches. And he'd be perfectly okay when people said, you know, my living room is pink, and could you do some pink into my portrait? But if anyone said, could I make it a little bigger or a little smaller, he would not do it. It had to be 40 by 40. And once I said, Andy, why are you so insistent on the 40 by 40 thing? You know, sometimes people want it bigger or smaller. And he said, because I want one day to have an exhibition called Portrait of Society, and I want to have one of every person I painted in one big, you know, interlocking portrait, and he wanted it to be at the Metropolitan Museum. Even that was all thought out.
I think there is ample interpretive apparatus in his work to read as profoundly as you want anything he did in the 70s and 80s. His iconography is consistent and deep, and his technologies are consistent and deep. Tape recording, Polaroiding, capturing, cropping, silk screening, doctoring, repeating, all these techniques of time theft and capture remain the same. And so I think that Warhol needs to be taken as an artist of inclusiveness, multiplicity, maniacal productivity, and that the spectacle of all that and the interlocking meanings that are set into play by so much work juxtaposed with so much work makes him great, not an isolated body of work. And so That's behind my advocacy of the work of the 70s and the 80s. It's simply part of the vastly interesting spectrum of his various obsessive quests.
I think of him as Charles Dickens, you know. Started writing when he was 19, wrote till he was 50-something, fell over dead. You know, just one after the other. You know, it's about working. And I don't think he ever thought about anything else. You know, I think he went to the factory during the blackout. Sat there dark and opened the mail, you know. It's taking care of business.
The thing that I carry myself is the work ethic that he had. You hear about how he was distracted, and you hear about the discos, and you hear about the hangers-on, and you hear about so many different things. The guy never lost his focus. He always worked. And sometimes it was less good than at other times, but the work was always there. And I think finally, really, really provocative.
He always did such amazing work. He didn't, like so many artists, burn out. I mean, he went on. He was always trying out something new, and he was progressing and not standing still.
I think The Last Suppers, that last series of work, can you imagine, right at the end, I mean, still with a kind of resonance, still with a topicality, still with an energy, you know. The Last Supper paintings, I think, are glorious, simply glorious, and stand up to virtually anything he ever did.
Trust Andy, of course, not to use for The Last Supper the Leonardo or a photograph of the Leonardo in Milan, but to buy a really cheap three-dimensional kind of version of it, the tackiest kind, and use that as his image. And I think he did it brilliantly. I think Andy must have felt some sense of doom, of foreboding, because it's so curious that this came just before he died.
What did he die of? Andy went to New York Hospital for a gallbladder operation, which was necessary.
Andy was in denial about the pain he was having from his gallbladder in the last days of his life, because he did not want to go to a hospital. He always said, if I go to a hospital again, I'll die.
But when it got so painful, he finally agreed with all of the friends that he should go in, and they did let him die. And it wasn't because of the gallbladder, it was because of negligence.
He was basically overhydrated. They didn't watch the intake of fluids. So he basically died because of too much fluid. He slowly drowned in the middle of the night.
He didn't want to go in, and he knew he shouldn't go in, because they almost let him die last time, but this time they did let him die.
At 6:31 a.m. on the morning of February 22nd, 1987, Andy Warhol was officially pronounced dead, a victim of negligence, medical accident, and administrative oversight. He was 58 years old.
Dying is the most embarrassing thing that can ever happen to you, because someone's got to take care of all your details. You've died, and someone's got to take care of the body, make the funeral arrangements, pick out the casket and the service, and the cemetery, and the clothes for you to wear, and get someone to style you and do the makeup. You'd like to help them, and most of all, you'd like to do the whole thing yourself, but you're dead, so you can't. Here you've spent your whole life trying to make enough money to take care of yourself so you won't bother anybody else with your problems. And then you wind up dumping the biggest problem ever in somebody else's lap. It's a shame. I never understood why when you died, you didn't just vanish and everything could just keep going the way it was, only you just wouldn't be there.
He came from a family that could hardly help him out with his education, you know, and he just made everything on his own. And what he accomplished, you know, by having his picture on a stamp, I guess he'd be surprised, you know. In Pittsburgh, I don't know anybody else that ever had a picture on a stamp.
And when I went to the museum in Pittsburgh, when it finally opened, I could see his spirit running up and down the walls like waterfalls, you know. And I said, this is Andy's mausoleum. My God, he got where he should be, you know. And his spirit is living in this whole place.
His place, as far as I'm concerned, is assured. Among the most serious people in the art world, among the most thoughtful people in the art world, Picasso owns the first half of the 20th century. And Andy, without question, owns the second half. The artists that affect change, real change, are so few and far between. They're just incredibly valuable. They can't be replaced. They're unique. You have to adore these people. You have to adore them because they contribute so much to the culture, you know. They are the culture. But mind you, he was about breaking boundaries. Always, you know. I just celebrate the guy's genius.
Did you really say that everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes?
Well, I think everybody is.
You didn't say that. You told me one time you didn't say that, actually.
No, I was just being funny. No, I said every 15 minutes someone will be famous, or every...
Next time on American Masters, meet Frank Gehry,
The leading architect in the world today.
and behold his astonishing buildings. See how he does it.
I call it a magic trick.
In Sketches of Frank Gehry, directed by Sidney Pollack on American Masters. To learn more about Andy Warhol, visit pbs.org. To order the Andy Warhol DVD or CD soundtrack, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
No, it's just great to be busy.
Mm-hmm.